The stone beneath your feet has been worn smooth by more than 200 years of footsteps, cartwheels, and the constant brushing of the mist that rises from the Rhône River. You can feel it through the thin leather soles of your shoes, a coolness that seems to travel upward from the rock itself and settle into the bones of your ankles. It is still early, and the sun has not yet climbed above the rooftops of Avignon to your left, so the bridge stretches out before you in a long line of grey arches that fade into the pale morning haze. This is the Pont Saint Bénézet, though most people simply call it the bridge, and you have stood here in this small alcove so many times that the shape of the stones under your feet feels as familiar as the palm of your own hand. You lean your shoulder against the inner wall of the tollkeeper's booth, which is not really a booth in the way a merchant stall is a booth, but rather a recess built directly into the stone parapet on the eastern side of the second arch. It is just wide enough for a man to stand sideways without scraping his elbows, and deep enough to hold a narrow shelf where the ledger rests, and a small wooden stool that you rarely use because sitting for too long makes the damp from the river creep up your spine. The alcove has a window cut through the thick stone, an opening shaped like a tall rectangle with an arched top, and it looks out over the roadway of the bridge itself so that you can see whoever approaches from either direction. A second smaller opening faces the river and lets in the sound of water that never stops moving. You arrived before the first true light of dawn because there is a particular quality to the morning air at this hour that you have come to appreciate. It is not the brightness that matters, but the stillness. The city of Avignon behind you is still asleep behind its high walls, and the town of Villeneuve on the far bank is likewise silent. The only sounds are the river and the occasional creak of the wooden gate of the bridge entrance settling into its hinges. You breathe in slowly, and the air smells of wet clay from the riverbank, a scent that is always present, but somehow stronger in the early hours before the dust of the day's traffic stirs it away. There is also the faint mineral smell of the limestone blocks themselves, a dry, ancient smell that reminds you of the interior of the chapel of St. Nicholas, which sits on the bridge just a few arches away. You have a small leather pouch tied to your belt with a length of hempen cord. The pouch is old, and the leather has darkened to a deep brown where your fingers have touched it most often. Inside the pouch are the tokens of your trade, the small objects that represent the tolls collected on this bridge. You loosen the drawstring and tip the contents carefully onto the stone shelf beside the ledger. The tokens clatter softly against each other with a sound like pebbles rolling in a shallow stream. There are discs of polished horn about the width of your thumb, their surfaces smooth from being handled and counted day after day. These are for pedestrians, a single person crossing the bridge on foot. There are small square pieces of bone, roughly the size of your thumbnail, cut from the shank of a sheep or a goat, and boiled clean long ago. These are for small livestock, a single sheep or a goat or a pig. And there are larger tokens made of flat wood cut from a plane tree, each one shaped like a small paddle, with a hole drilled through the handle so they can be strung on a cord if necessary. These represent a cart or a wagon, the vehicles that carry goods to market. You count the horn discs first, touching each one with the tip of your index finger as you move them from the left side of the pile to the right. There are 30 of them this morning, enough for the usual foot traffic of a quiet weekday. Then you count the bone squares, stacking them in small piles of 5 so that you can see the total at a glance. 20 bone tokens sit on the shelf, 4 stacks of 5, and you think this will likely be sufficient for the small herds of sheep or goats that might cross before noon. The wooden cart tokens are fewer, only 8 of them, but this is not a market day, and you do not expect many heavy wagons. You slide the tokens back into the pouch, but keep the drawstring loose around the neck of the bag so that you can reach inside easily without looking. The ledger rests on the stone shelf where you left it the previous evening. It is a book made of paper rather than the expensive vellum used by the papal scribes in the Great Palace, and the pages are uneven at the edges where they would cut from a larger sheet with a knife that was not particularly sharp. The cover is a piece of stiffened leather that has warped slightly from the damp air of the river, so that the book does not lie entirely flat when you open it. You turn to the current page and run your palm across the surface to smooth it down. The paper is rough and fibrous, with small flecks of darker material embedded in the pulp that you can feel as tiny bumps under your skin. The page is divided into columns by lines you drew yourself with a straight edge of split reed. There is a column for the date, a column for the type of crossing, a column for the number of animals or carts, and a wider column for any notes you might need to make about the toll received. You take up the quill from where it rests in a crack between two stones at the back of the shelf. The feather is from a goose, a grey primary flight feather that has been stripped of most of its barbs except for a few at the very top where they help balance the shaft in your hand. You test the point of the nib against the soft pad of your thumb and feel the small scratch of the sharpened tip. There is a bit of dried ink crusted near the base of the slit, so you scrape it away carefully with your thumbnail, letting the dart flakes fall onto the stone where they will be blown away by the next breeze. The inkwell sits in a hollow carved into the shelf specifically to hold it steady. It is a small horn container with a wide base and a narrow neck, fitted with a tight plug of cork that you twist free with 2 fingers. The ink inside is a deep brownish black, made from oak galls and iron salts and gum arabic, and it has thickened slightly overnight so that a thin skin has formed across the surface. You break the skin with the tip of the quill and stir the ink gently in a slow circle. The light has changed while you are preparing your materials. The haze over the river has thinned and taken on a warmer tone, shifting from grey to something closer to the colour of unbleached linen. You can see the far bank more clearly now, the line of willows and poplars whose leaves hang motionless in the still morning air. The water of the Rhône moves past the bridge pilings with a sound that is not loud but is constant, a deep rushing that is punctuated by smaller splashes and gurgles where the current divides around the cutwaters. The cutwaters are the wedge-shaped stone structures built upstream of each bridge arch, designed to split the flow of the river and protect the piers from the force of floods. You have watched them do their work through many seasons, and you know that the water level is lower than usual for this time of year, leaving a dark band of algae and river slime exposed on the lower stones. You step out of the alcove for a moment and stand on the roadway of the bridge itself. The stone surface here is made of large irregular blocks, fitted together with thin gaps that have been filled with smaller chips and packed earth. The roadway is just wide enough for a single cart to pass with a few handspans to spare on either side. You look down the length of the bridge toward the Villeneuve side and see that the wooden gate at the far end is still closed, its iron hinges dark against the pale wood. The chapel of St. Nicholas rises from the bridge about halfway across, a small 2-story structure built directly onto the stone arches, with a bell tower that is visible even from here. The chapel door is closed, and the small window above the altar shows no light. The bell will not ring until the hour of terce when the canons come to say the morning office. You turn and look back toward Avignon. The city walls rise up from the bank, tall and crenellated, built from the same pale limestone as the bridge. Beyond the walls you can see the roofs of the houses, and above them the great mass of the palace of the popes, its towers catching the first true sunlight, so that they glow a soft gold against the pale blue of the sky. The palace has been quiet for many years now, ever since Pope Gregory returned the papal court to Rome. But the building remains, and so do the cardinals and the officials and the clerks who keep the machinery of administration turning. You are a small part of that machinery, even though you never enter the palace itself. The toll you collect is a papal revenue, and the lockbox you fill each day will eventually find its way to the offices of the Apostolic Camera, where some clerk will count the tokens and enter the totals into a much larger and more important ledger than yours. You return to the alcove and pick up the quill again. There is a ritual to beginning the day's entries that you have performed so many times it requires no conscious thought. You dip the nib into the ink and tap it twice against the rim of the horn to shake off the excess. Then you write the date at the top of the first column. The year is 1387 and the month is late spring, though you do not write the year because everyone who might read this ledger already knows what year it is. You write simply the day and the month in a careful hand, forming the letters with small strokes that join together in a script you learned long ago from a priest who smelled of candle wax and old bread. The ink sinks into the paper fibers and spreads just slightly so that the edges of the letters are soft rather than sharp. You set the quill down in its resting crack and listen to the river. The water is the true clock of this place, more reliable than any mechanical device or bell tower. You can tell the time of day by the way the light strikes the water and the way the shadows fall across the arches. Right now the shadow of the chapel bell tower falls across the third arch from the Avignon bank a dark rectangle of shade that will creep slowly eastward as the sun climbs. By midday, the shadow will have shrunk to almost nothing directly beneath the tower, and by late afternoon, it will stretch out toward the Villeneuve side. You have watched this progression so many times that you no longer think about it consciously, but some part of your mind is always tracking the movement of the light. The first sound of the day reaches you from the city side. It is the creak of the wooden gate at the near end of the bridge being pulled open by the guard whose name you have never learned, but whose face you know as well as the stones under your feet. The guard is an older man with a grey beard and a limp that favours his left leg. You hear the scrape of the gate bar being lifted from its iron brackets, and then the slower groan of the gate itself swinging outward. A few moments later, the guard passes your alcove on his way to open the far gate as well. He raises one hand in a brief greeting, but does not speak, and you raise your own hand in return. Words are not necessary for this small ritual. You have exchanged this same silent greeting for years, and the familiarity of it is like the familiarity of the river's sound. The bridge is now open for the day. You adjust your position in the alcove so that you can see clearly through the window that faces the roadway. The first traveller will come soon, perhaps a farmer with a cart of vegetables or a messenger on foot, carrying letters from the papal offices to some small parish in the countryside. Until then, you wait, and the waiting is not an empty space, but a fullness of small sensations. The cool stone against your shoulder, the faint smell of ink and old paper from the ledger, the weight of the token pouch against your hip, the endless voice of the Rhône moving beneath the arches, speaking in a language made entirely of water sounds that no one has ever needed to translate. The light grows stronger, and the day begins to warm, and you stand in your small stone room on the bridge and breathe slowly in and out, counting nothing at all for just a few moments longer. The pouch of tokens hangs from your belt with a familiar weight that you've come to understand as a kind of constant in your days. It is not heavy in the way a purse of silver coins might be heavy, but it has a presence that you notice whenever you shift your stance or turn to look toward the far end of the bridge. The leather of the pouch is old and has been shaped by years of use into a form that fits the curve of your hip, the surface marked with small creases and a darker stain where the oil from your fingers has soaked into the hide over countless repetitions of opening and closing the drawstring. You reach down and touch the pouch now, not because you need to count the tokens again, but because the gesture itself has become a small comfort, a way of grounding yourself in the quiet minutes before the day's work begins in earnest. Inside the pouch, the tokens rest against one another in a loose jumble, and when you move they shift with a soft dry sound like fallen leaves stirring on a stone path. You have handled these tokens so many times that you can identify each type by touch alone, without looking. The horn discs are smooth and slightly cool against your fingertips, their edges rounded and worn so that they feel almost like river pebbles. The bone squares have a different quality entirely, a faint roughness on their faces where the original texture of the bone was never completely polished away, and their edges are sharper, cut at right angles, that you can feel as distinct corners. The wooden cart tokens are larger and lighter than you expect each time you pick one up, the plane tree wood having dried to a pale blonde color that feels almost weightless compared to the density of the horn and bone. You decide to empty the pouch onto the stone shelf again, not out of any pressing need, but because the morning light is now strong enough to see the tokens clearly, and there is a small satisfaction in arranging them in neat rows. You loosen the drawstring and tip the contents carefully onto the flat stone beside the ledger, using your other hand to cup the edge of the shelf so that none of the smaller pieces roll off into the shadows of the alcove. The tokens spill out in a small pile, and you begin the slow work of sorting them by type. The horn discs you gather first, sliding them across the stone with the side of your hand until they form a single cluster. You count them again as you arrange them into a stack, placing one disc on top of another with the care of someone who has handled these objects long enough to treat them with a kind of absent respect. There are 30 discs this morning, and as you stack them you notice the subtle variations in their color. Some are a pale cream with faint streaks of darker brown, others are nearly black at the center where the horn was closest to the animal's skull, and a few have a translucent quality around their edges where the material is thinnest. You place the stack to the left side of the shelf, where it will be within easy reach when the first foot travelers begin to cross. The bone squares come next, and these require a bit more attention because they are smaller and have a tendency to scatter if you are not careful. You pick them up one at a time and arrange them in a grid pattern on the stone, 5 squares across and 4 squares down, so that the total of 20 is visible at a glance. The bone has yellowed with age, taking on the color of old parchment or the foam that collects at the edges of the river after a storm. Each square has a small hole drilled through one corner, a detail that you have always found curious because you have never seen anyone string these tokens on a cord in all your years on the bridge. Perhaps once, long before your time, the toll-keepers wore the bone tokens around their necks or hung them from hooks inside the booth. Now they simply rest in the pouch and wait to be counted. The wooden cart tokens are the largest and easiest to manage. You gather all 8 of them and fan them out in your palm like a hand of playing cards, noting the grain of the wood that runs in parallel lines across each paddle-shaped piece. The wood has absorbed the oils from your skin over the months and years, so that the surfaces have a soft sheen that catches the morning light. You stack these tokens together and place them at the back of the shelf near the inkwell, where they will not be accidentally knocked to the floor by an errant movement of your elbow. With the tokens arranged to your satisfaction, you turn your attention back to the quill that rests in its crack between the stones. The feather is a familiar object, one that you have replaced many times over the seasons as the old quills wore down or broke, or simply became too soft to hold a sharp point. This particular quill is perhaps 2 weeks old and has settled into a comfortable state of use. The shaft is still firm enough to provide good control, but the nib has worn just slightly to match the angle at which you hold your hand when you write. You pick it up and examine the point in the light from the river window. The slit that runs up from the tip is clean and straight, and the 2 halves of the nib are even with one another, a small but important detail that ensures the ink will flow smoothly, rather than blob or skip. You reach for the small knife that you keep in a fold of your belt, a simple iron blade with a handle of wrapped leather that is darkened to the color of wet bark. The knife is not sharp enough for any serious cutting, but it serves well for trimming quills and scraping dried ink from surfaces. You test the edge against your thumb and find it adequate for the small task ahead. Holding the quill carefully with the feather pointing away from your body, you make a tiny cut across the very tip of the nib to refresh the writing surface. The cut is no wider than a hair and removes only the smallest fragment of the worn shaft, which falls onto the stone shelf and is immediately invisible against the grey surface. You then make a second cut, this one angled slightly to reshape the point into the profile you prefer, a shape that produces a line of medium width with a slight variation between the downstrokes and the cross strokes. The quill now feels right in your hand, balanced and ready. You set it down and turn to the inkwell, that small horn container that has been your companion through countless days on the bridge. The ink inside is a dark liquid that you make yourself in batches that last several months, following a recipe that was taught to you by the previous toll-keeper, whose name you can no longer recall, but whose instructions you have never forgotten. The base of the ink is water from the Rhône itself, drawn from the river on a day when the current ran clear rather than muddy. To this water you added powdered oak galls, those strange round growths that form on the branches of oak trees when insects lay their eggs in the bark. The galls are rich in tannic acid, and when they are crushed and soaked in water, they produce a pale brown liquid that smells faintly of earth and old wood. To this liquid you added iron salts scraped from the rust that forms on old nails left out in the rain, and the combination of tannin and iron creates a chemical reaction that turns the pale brown into a deep, rich black. A small amount of gum arabic, the hardened sap of acacia trees that arrives in Avignon with the trade caravans from the east, is dissolved into the mixture to thicken it slightly and help the ink adhere to the paper fibers without spreading too far. You stir the ink with the tip of the quill once more, watching the small vortex that forms in the center of the horn and then dissipates. The ink is at a good consistency today, not too thick and not too thin, and it clings to the nib when you dip it in. You lift the quill and hold it above the inkwell for a moment to let any excess drip back into the reservoir. Then you touch the point to a scrap of waste paper that you keep folded at the back of the shelf for testing. A small line of dark ink appears on the paper, crisp at the edges and evenly dark throughout its length. The quill writes smoothly without catching or scratching, and the line is the width you prefer for the entries in the ledger. You are satisfied. The ledger itself waits on the shelf, its pages open to the current day. You have already written the date at the top of the page in your careful hand, And now you look at the empty columns that stretch down toward the bottom of the sheet. The paper is a pale tan color, with a slightly uneven surface that you have come to know intimately. When you run your fingers over the page, you can feel the faint ridges left by the wires of the papermaker's mold, a pattern of parallel lines and a few widely spaced chain lines that cross them at right angles. In one corner of the page, there is a watermark visible when you hold the sheet up to the light from the river window. The watermark is a simple design of a bell tower with a cross at its peak, the mark of the paper mill somewhere in the countryside north of here that supplies the papal offices with their writing materials. You have seen this same watermark on countless pages over the years, and it has become a familiar sight, as unremarkable as the pattern of the stones in the arch above your head. You review the column headings you have written on this page, though you know them so well that reading them is more habit than necessity. The first column is for the type of crossing, where you will note whether the toll was paid for a pedestrian, for livestock, or for a cart. The second column is for the quantity, a simple number that corresponds to the tokens you will place in the lockbox. The third column is wider and serves for any additional information that might be useful to the clerks who will eventually review this ledger. In this column you sometimes write the name of the village from which a farmer has come or a description of the goods being transported, though more often you leave it blank because the information is not required and the ink is not free. You close the ledger for a moment and place both palms flat on its worn leather cover. The book has a weight to it that is more than the simple mass of paper and binding. It contains the record of many days just like this one, days that stretch back in time and will stretch forward into a future you cannot see. Each page is a small monument to the quiet work of counting and recording, work that will be read by someone else and then stored away in a chest or on a shelf where it will slowly gather dust and fade. You think about this sometimes when the bridge is empty and the river is the only voice you hear, but the thought is not a heavy one. It is simply a fact, like the fact that the water flows downstream or that the sun rises over the palace walls each morning. The lockbox sits on the floor of the alcove near your right foot, the small iron-bound chest with a hinged lid and the simple lock that requires a key you wear on a cord around your neck. The key is iron as well, dark with age and shaped like a small cross with a single tooth at its end. You have not yet placed any tokens into the box today because no travelers have crossed the bridge since you opened the gate. The box is empty, and its emptiness is a kind of potential, a space that will slowly fill as the hours pass. The sound that a token makes when it drops into the box depends on what falls on top of what. A horn disc falling onto the bare wooden bottom makes a light click, almost musical in its clarity. A bone square makes a softer sound, more of a tap than a click. The wooden cart tokens land with a dull thud that has no resonance at all. By the end of the day, when the box is partially full, each new token will land on a bed of its fellows, and the sound will be muffled and complex, a small rattle of shifting pieces that you hear without really listening. You shift your weight from one foot to the other and feel the familiar ache in your lower back that comes from standing on stone for long hours. The ache is not painful exactly, but it is present, a reminder that your body is made of softer materials than the bridge you stand upon. You have learned to manage this discomfort by changing your position frequently, sometimes leaning against the inner wall of the alcove, sometimes stepping out onto the roadway to stretch your legs and look toward one end of the bridge or the other. The movement helps, and the brief change in perspective helps as well, pulling your attention away from the small details of the booth and toward the larger world of the river and the sky and the distant rooftops. The light has continued to strengthen while you have been attending to your small tasks. The shadow of the chapel bell tower has moved noticeably since you first noted its position, creeping across the stone arches with a slowness that is imperceptible moment by moment, but unmistakable when you look away and then look back. The water of the Rhône has changed color as well, shifting from the grey-green of early morning to a softer blue that reflects the sky above. You can see the current more clearly now, the way the water moves in broad sheets that wrinkle and fold over submerged obstacles. Near the cutwaters the flow divides cleanly, and you can watch the two streams rejoin on the downstream side, with a small turbulence that creates a line of tiny whirlpools spinning slowly in the eddy. A single bird flies low over the river, a swift or a swallow, you cannot tell which at this distance. It dips toward the water and then rises again with a movement that seems effortless, a simple curve of flight that requires no apparent thought or effort. You watch it until it disappears behind the chapel, and then you turn back to the alcove and the waiting tokens and the empty page of the ledger. The day is beginning, and somewhere on the road that leads to the bridge a traveller is walking, or a cart is rolling slowly toward the gate. You will hear them before you see them, the sound of footsteps on packed earth or the creak of an axle, and when you hear them, you will stand ready at the window with the tokens in your pouch and the quill in your hand. Until that moment you wait, and the waiting is filled with the small sounds of the river and the bridge, and your own slow breathing in the quiet stone room above the water. The sound reaches you before anything else, a faint irregular creaking that seems to come from somewhere beyond the city gate. You have been standing at the window of the alcove with your eyes unfocused and your attention resting on the movement of the river below, but the creaking pulls your awareness back to the roadway in front of you. It is a sound you know well, the complaint of an iron-rimmed wheel turning on a wooden axle that has not been greased in some time. The pitch of the squeak rises and falls with each rotation of the wheel, a rhythmic pattern that tells you the cart is moving slowly and steadily toward the bridge. You turn your head slightly to better catch the direction of the sound, and you are certain now that it comes from the Villeneuve side, the far bank where the road leads away into the countryside and eventually to the smaller villages that dot the hills north of the river. You shift your weight and adjust your position so that you are standing squarely in front of the roadway window. The morning light is now bright enough to cast clear shadows, and the stone of the bridge glows with a pale warmth that it did not possess an hour ago. You can see the length of the bridge stretching toward the far gate, a line of grey arches diminishing in perspective until they meet the green bank on the other side. The wooden gate at the Villeneuve end is open, held back against the stone pillar by an iron hook, and through the opening you can see a section of the road that climbs gently away from the river. At first you see only the dust rising from the road surface, a thin haze of pale particles lifted by the passage of something moving. Then you see the horse. The horse is a draft animal of the kind common in this region, a heavy-bodied creature with a broad chest and thick legs that end in large hooves fringed with feathering. Its coat is a dark brown that looks almost black in the morning light, though you know from experience that in full sun this color would reveal itself as a deep bay with reddish undertones. The horse walks with its head lowered slightly, its neck bowed in a posture of patient labor that speaks of many years spent pulling loads along roads just like this one. You can hear the sound of its hooves now, a steady 4-beat rhythm that underlies the higher creaking of the cart wheel. One of the hooves makes a slightly different sound than the others, a looser clop that suggests the iron shoe on that foot is not fitted as tightly as it should be. You make a mental note of this detail without any particular reason, simply because your mind has grown accustomed to noticing small variations in the sounds that approach your toll booth. The cart comes fully into view as the horse steps onto the first arch of the bridge. It is a simple farm cart of the sort you see many times each week, built from local wood and assembled with iron brackets at the corners. The bed of the cart is a flat platform of planks laid side by side with small gaps between them, and the sides are formed by upright stakes driven into sockets along the edges with horizontal rails lashed to them using strips of rawhide. The load this morning is hay, a tall mound of dried grass that rises well above the driver's head and is secured with a net of coarse rope tied down to rings set into the cart frame. The hay is the pale gold color of late spring cutting, and as the cart moves across the uneven stones of the bridge surface, small wisps of dried grass break loose and float away on the breeze, drifting down toward the river like tiny golden birds. The driver walks beside the horse rather than riding on the cart. This is common practice among the farmers who cross your bridge, a habit born of economy rather than comfort. A man walking can lighten the load by his own weight and spare the animal some small measure of effort on the journey. The driver is a man of middle years with a face that has been shaped by weather and time into a pattern of lines and creases that you cannot read from this distance. He wears a simple tunic of undyed wool that falls to his knees, belted at the waist with a length of rope from which hangs a small leather pouch, not unlike your own. His legs are wrapped in cloth strips that serve as leggings, and his feet are shod in simple shoes of thick leather with wooden soles that make a soft scuffing sound against the stones. A cap of felted wool covers his head and shades his eyes from the morning sun, which is now high enough to cast a glare on the river and the pale stone of the bridge. You watch the cart approach with the patient attention that has become second nature to you. The distance from the far gate to your alcove is not great in terms of actual measurement, perhaps 200 paces along the curve of the bridge, but the slowness of the horse's walk stretches this distance into a small journey of its own. You have time to observe the details of the load, to notice the way the hay is packed more tightly on the left side than the right, to see the places where the rope net has pressed deep grooves into the dried grass. You have time to notice that one of the iron tires on the cart wheels has a small crack near the joint where the ends of the metal band were welded together, a detail that the driver may or may not be aware of. You have time to see the small cloud of dust that rises from the hay each time the cart jolts over a particularly uneven stone, a fine powder of dried plant matter and field soil that hangs in the air for a moment before settling back onto the load. The squeak of the axle grows louder as the cart draws nearer, and you can now identify exactly which wheel is making the sound. It is the rear wheel on the right side, the one that passes closest to your alcove window. You can see the hub of the wheel turning against the axle end, and you can see the place where the wood has worn smooth and shiny from friction. A smear of old grease has long since dried and cracked, leaving dark residue in the grain of the wood, but providing no lubrication. The driver will need to address this eventually, perhaps when he reaches the market and has a moment to borrow a pot of tallow from one of the smiths who work near the square. For now, he simply walks on, his face expressionless and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When the horse is perhaps 10 paces from your alcove, the driver looks up and meets your eyes. You have seen this moment countless times, and it always unfolds in the same quiet way. There is a brief acknowledgement, a nod of the head that says without words that the driver understands the toll must be paid and is prepared to pay it. You nod in return and reach for the wooden cart token that rests on the stone shelf beside the ledger. The driver stops the horse with a low word that you cannot quite hear, a sound more like a hum than a spoken command, and the animal halts immediately with its large head hanging just outside your window. The cart creaks to a stop behind it, the hay swaying slightly with the change in momentum. The driver steps toward your window and reaches into the small pouch at his belt. He produces a single coin, a silver denier of the kind minted in Avignon under papal authority. The coin is small and thin, worn smooth in places so that the image of the keys of Saint Peter is barely visible on its face. You do not take the coin directly from his hand. Instead, you reach for the wooden cart token and hold it up so that he can see it clearly, a small ritual that confirms the toll required for his type of crossing. The driver nods again and places the silver denier on the stone ledge of your window where it sits catching the morning light. You pick up the coin and drop it into the lockbox through a slot cut into the iron-bound lid for this purpose. The coin falls onto the bare wooden bottom with a small clear ring, the first sound of its kind to fill the box today. You take the wooden cart token and hold it for a moment, feeling its familiar lightness in your palm. Then you reach out through the window and hand it to the driver. He takes it without comment and tucks it into his belt pouch. The token will serve as his proof of payment when he reaches the Avignon gate, though in truth the guards there know him by sight and would likely wave him through regardless. The system of tokens is older than any of you, a practice established long ago to prevent disputes and ensure that the papal treasury receives its due from every crossing. You do not know who designed this system or when it began, only that it has been in place for as long as anyone can remember and that it works with a quiet efficiency that requires no explanation. With the toll paid, you turn to the ledger and pick up the quill. The driver watches you without impatience as you dip the nib into the ink and tap it twice against the rim of the horn. You write in the first column the word for cart, a simple abbreviation that you have used so many times it flows from the quill without conscious thought. In the second column, you write the numeral 1, a single vertical stroke with a small serif at the top. The third column you leave blank for now, though you consider writing something about the hay or the squeaking wheel before deciding that such details are unnecessary. The ink sinks into the paper and dries almost immediately in the warm air that moves through the alcove from the river window. You set the quill down and look up at the driver. He has been waiting patiently, his hand resting on the horse's shoulder, his eyes wandering across the familiar view of the bridge and the river and the city walls beyond. When he sees that you have finished your writing, he gives you a final nod and makes the low humming sound to his horse. The animal responds by leaning into its harness, the leather straps creaking as they take up the weight of the cart. The iron-rimmed wheels begin to turn again, and the squeak of the dry axle resumes its rhythmic pattern. The cart moves past your window slowly, the hay brushing against the stone of the alcove with a soft rustling sound that leaves a few more wisps of dried grass floating in the air. You watch the cart continue along the bridge toward the Avignon gate, the driver walking steadily beside his horse, the load of hay swaying gently with each rotation of the wheels. The sound of the cart fades gradually as it moves away from you. The squeak of the axle becomes a little fainter with each passing moment, though you can still hear it clearly even when the cart has reached the middle of the bridge near the chapel of St. Nicholas. The hooves of the horse make a softer sound on the stones now, and you notice that the loose shoe continues to click with its own distinctive rhythm. You listen to these sounds until they are absorbed into the larger soundscape of the river and the city and the morning air, and then you are alone again in your alcove, with the tokens and the ledger and the gentle voice of the water below. You look down at the entry you have made in the ledger. The ink has dried completely, and the line of writing sits on the page with a permanence that is both satisfying and slightly melancholy. This single cart and its load of hay are now part of the record, a small fact that will be read by someone else in some other room on some other day. The thought does not trouble you. It is simply the nature of the work you do, the slow accumulation of small facts into a larger pattern that no single person ever sees in its entirety. You are one part of a system that extends far beyond this bridge, connecting the farmers who grow hay to the horses that eat it, the horses that pull carts to the markets where goods are sold, the markets that pay rents to the papal treasury, the treasury that funds the maintenance of the bridge on which you stand. It is a circle of exchange that turns as steadily as the wheels of the cart that has just passed, and you are a small but necessary part of its motion. You reach into your pouch and feel for the remaining wooden tokens. There were 8 this morning, and now there are 7. The missing token is in the driver's belt pouch, traveling toward the city gate where it will be collected by the guard and eventually returned to you or to another toll keeper on another day. The tokens circulate through the world in this way, passing from hand to hand and back again, worn smooth by the touch of many fingers, just as the stones of the bridge are worn smooth by the passage of many feet. You think about this sometimes when you hold a token that seems older than the others, its surface polished to a soft gleam that speaks of long use. The token you gave to the driver this morning was one of the newer ones, its wood still pale and its edges still sharp. When it returns to you, it will be slightly different, marked by the journey it has made. The river continues to flow beneath the arches with its endless, patient voice. You lean against the inner wall of the alcove and let your gaze rest on the water as it moves past the cutwater and divides around the pier. The surface of the Rhône is never still, but it is also never hurried. It moves at the pace that rivers have always moved, a pace that is measured in centuries rather than hours. A small branch floats past, carried by the current with its leaves still green and its bark still wet from wherever it fell into the water upstream. You watch it approach the cutwater and you wonder briefly which side it will take, the left channel or the right. The current decides for you, pulling the branch toward the left where it slides past the stone with a small scrape and continues on its way downstream until it passes out of sight beneath the next arch. The morning is still young, and the first cart has come and gone. You will count many more crossings before the sun sets, each one a small repetition of the ritual you have just performed. A token will be exchanged, a line will be written in the ledger, and the traveller will continue on their way, while you remain here in your stone room above the water. This is the shape of your days, and you have come to accept it, as you accept the shape of the stones under your feet and the weight of the pouch against your hip. There is no need for anything more than this. The quiet work of counting and recording is enough, and the river will keep you company through all the hours until the light fades and the gate is closed and the bridge falls silent once more. The morning settles into a rhythm that you have come to know as intimately as your own breathing. After the hay cart disappears through the Avignon gate, there is a space of quiet that stretches across the bridge like a held breath, and during this space you find yourself listening more than watching. The river is the foundation of all sound here, a deep, continuous note that rises from beneath the arches and fills the air with its presence, Above this foundation, other sounds arrange themselves in layers that shift and change as the minutes pass. You hear the distant cry of a gull somewhere downstream, a harsh call that echoes off the stone walls of the city and returns to you, softened by distance. You hear the small lapping of water against the cutwater directly below your alcove, a sound that is more felt than heard, a gentle percussion that marks the meeting of current and stone. And you hear the creak of the wooden gate at the far end of the bridge as a gust of wind moves across the river and presses against its planks. You have been standing in the alcove for some time now, and the muscles of your lower back have begun to send their familiar reminder that stone is an unforgiving surface. You shift your weight to your other foot and roll your shoulders slowly, feeling the small release of tension that comes with the movement. The light has changed again, while you were not paying attention, climbing higher and growing warmer, so that the shadow of the chapel bell tower has shortened considerably. When you first noted its position this morning, it stretched across the third arch in a long, dark rectangle. Now it has retreated to the base of the tower itself, a compact pool of shade that offers no relief to anyone crossing the bridge. The stones of the roadway have begun to warm under the sun, and you can see the faint shimmer of heat rising from their surface, a distortion in the air that makes the far end of the bridge appear to waver slightly. You look down at the ledger page, where the single entry for the hay cart sits in the first row of the day. The ink is fully dry now, and the line of writing has become part of the paper, a permanent mark that will remain long after this day has ended. You run your fingertip lightly over the surface of the page and feel the slight roughness where the ink has stiffened the paper fibers, a texture that is different from the surrounding area. This small difference is one of the many details that you have learned to notice over the years, the way that ink changes the feel of the page as well as its appearance. The paper beneath the written line is slightly harder and smoother than the untouched paper beside it, and when you close your eyes and touch the page, you can locate the entry by this tactile difference alone. The sound of the river changes subtly, and you look up from the ledger. The current has shifted its pattern around the cutwater, a small adjustment that you have learned to recognize as a sign of something passing upstream. You lean toward the river window and look down at the water directly below the alcove. At first you see only the familiar flow, the broad sheets of green-blue water moving past the stone pier. Then you notice a disturbance near the surface, a series of small ripples that spread outward in expanding circles before being absorbed by the current. A fish has risen from the depths to take something from the surface, perhaps an insect that landed too close to the water. You watch the ripples fade and disappear, erased by the steady movement of the Rhône, as though they had never existed. The fish does not rise again, and the surface returns to its previous state, a flowing mirror that reflects the pale stone of the bridge arches and the softer blue of the sky above. You hear a new sound now, one that comes from the city side rather than the far bank. It is not the creak of wheels or the clop of hooves, but something softer and more diffuse, a low murmur that seems to be made of many small sounds layered together. You turn to the roadway window and look toward the Avignon gate. At first you see nothing unusual, only the empty bridge stretching toward the stone arch of the city entrance. Then you see movement at the gate itself, a shifting mass of pale shapes that seem to flow rather than walk. The shapes resolve into individual animals as they emerge from the shadow of the gate and step onto the sunlit bridge. Sheep. A flock of sheep is being driven across the bridge from the city side toward Villeneuve, which is less common than the opposite direction, but not unusual. Sometimes the shepherds bring their animals into the city for a market day, and then drive them back out again when the trading is done. The sheep move in a loose formation that shifts and reforms as they walk. They are not a single, organized column, but rather a flowing group that spreads across the width of the roadway and sometimes bunches together when the animals at the front hesitate or change direction. The wool is a pale cream color that catches the morning light and glows softly against the grey stone of the bridge. You can see variations in the shade of their coats, some nearly white and others a warmer tone that leans toward beige, and you can see the dark faces and legs that mark them as a local breed, common to the hills around Avignon. The sound of their movement reaches you as a soft percussion of small hooves clicking against stone, hundreds of individual steps that merge into a continuous rustling rhythm like rain falling on a thatched roof. There are two shepherds walking with the flock, one at the front and one at the rear. The shepherd at the front is an older man with a staff made from a straight branch of chestnut wood, its surface polished dark by years of handling. He walks slowly with the measured pace of someone who has spent his life moving at the speed of sheep, and he does not look back at the flock because he knows they will follow him without needing to be watched. The shepherd at the rear is younger, perhaps the son or grandson of the older man, and he carries a smaller stick that he uses occasionally to guide a sheep that strays too far to one side or the other. Both shepherds wear simple wool tunics, similar in color to the sheep themselves, so that from a distance they appear to be part of the flock, slightly larger animals moving with the same patient rhythm. You watch the flock approach and begin your preparations for counting. The bone square tokens are arranged on the stone shelf in their grid of 5 by 4, and you will need to count the sheep as they pass your window. Counting a flock of sheep is different from counting a cart or a single pedestrian. The animals do not pass in a neat line but in a flowing group, and they have a tendency to circle or bunch together so that individual animals are difficult to distinguish. You have developed a method for this work over the years, a way of letting your gaze soften and your attention widen so that you can count without counting, allowing the number to accumulate in your mind as the animals flow past rather than trying to tally each one individually. The older shepherd reaches your alcove first and stops, leaning on his chestnut staff with the ease of long practice. He looks at you with pale eyes set in a face that has been weathered by sun and wind until it resembles the bark of an old olive tree. You nod to him, and he nods in return, a silent exchange that acknowledges the transaction about to take place. The sheep continue to move past the alcove as the two of you stand there, a river of wool and small hooves that flows around the shepherd as though he were a stone in a stream. The animals pay no attention to you or to your window, their dark faces fixed on the road ahead and their ears flicking occasionally at the sound of the river or the call of a bird. You begin your count as the first sheep pass the edge of your window frame. You do not count aloud, and you do not mark anything in the ledger yet. You simply let the number form in your mind, a quiet accumulation that rises as the flock flows by. 1 becomes 5, becomes 10, becomes 15. The sheep are close enough now that you can see the details of their wool, the way it mats together in places and separates in others, the small burrs and bits of dried grass that cling to the outer layer. You can smell them too, a warm animal smell that is not unpleasant but is very present, the odor of lanolin and dust and the green scent of the hills where they have been grazing. The smell fills the alcove and mingles with the river air and the faint ink smell from the ledger, creating a temporary atmosphere that will fade as soon as the flock has passed. 20 sheep have gone by now, and you continue your silent count. The younger shepherd passes your window and gives you a brief glance, his face curious but not intrusive. He is perhaps 14 or 15 years old, with the same pale eyes as the older man, but a smoother face that has not yet been shaped by decades of weather. He carries a leather water flask slung across his body and a small cloth bag that likely contains bread and cheese for the midday meal. He does not stop, but continues walking with the flock, his small stick held loosely in one hand, and his attention divided between the sheep and the view of the river that opens up as he moves farther onto the bridge. 30 sheep now, and you can see the end of the flock approaching, a straggling group of older animals that move more slowly than the rest. One of these sheep has a slight limp, favoring its right foreleg, and it falls behind the main group so that a gap opens between it and the animals ahead. The younger shepherd notices and drops back to encourage the limping sheep with gentle taps of his stick against the stone, not striking the animal, but creating a sound that urges it forward. The sheep responds by increasing its pace slightly, and the gap begins to close. The last of the sheep pass your window, and you hold the final number in your mind. 42 animals in total. You look at the older shepherd, who has been waiting patiently beside your alcove throughout the counting. He reaches into a pouch at his belt and produces a small handful of silver coins, similar to the denier paid by the farmer with the hay cart, but these are smaller and thinner, the kind of fractional coins that are used for smaller transactions. He counts them out onto the stone ledge of your window, placing each coin with a deliberate care that speaks of a man who does not part easily with money. The total comes to an amount that matches the toll for 42 sheep, a rate that has been fixed by custom and papal decree for longer than either of you has been alive. You do not take the coins immediately. Instead, you reach for the bone square tokens on your shelf and begin counting them out to match the number of sheep. You do not count out 42 individual tokens because that would be impractical for both you and the shepherd. Instead, you use a system of larger and smaller tokens that represents the total in a more manageable form. You give the shepherd 4 of the larger bone tokens, each representing 10 sheep, and 2 of the smaller ones, each representing a single animal. The shepherd takes the tokens and examines them briefly, though you suspect he has seen these same tokens many times before. He places them in his pouch and gives you a final nod before turning to follow his flock across the bridge. You watch him walk away, and then you turn to the coins on the window ledge. You pick them up one by one and drop them through the slot in the lockbox lid, listening to the small sounds they make as they land on top of the single coin from the hay cart. The sounds are different now because the box is no longer empty, each new coin landing on the one before it with a soft click rather than a clear ring. You will hear this sound many more times before the day is over, the gradual filling of the box with the small proofs of crossing. With the coin secured, you take up the quill and turn to the ledger. You dip the nib into the ink and write in the first column the abbreviation for livestock, a different mark than the one you used for the cart. In the second column, you write the numeral for 42, forming the digits with careful strokes so that there can be no confusion about the count. The third column you consider for a moment before writing a brief note about the flock and its direction of travel, information that might be useful to the clerks who will review this ledger at the end of the month. The ink dries quickly in the warm air that moves through the alcove, and the entry becomes a permanent part of the page. You set the quill down and look out the roadway window toward the far end of the bridge. The flock has nearly reached the Villeneuve Gate, a moving mass of pale wool that seems to glow against the darker green of the trees on the far bank. The 2 shepherds walk with the sheep, their figures small at this distance but still visible, still moving with that patient rhythm that matches the pace of the animals in their care. You watch until the last sheep passes through the gate and disappears from view, and then the bridge is empty again, except for the light and the river and the slow movement of shadows across the ancient stones. The silence that follows the passing of the flock is different from the silence that came before it. There is a quality of settling now, a return to the baseline quiet that underlies all the other sounds of the bridge. You can still hear the river, of course, that constant voice that never pauses or changes its essential nature. But the smaller sounds have faded, the click of hooves and the rustle of wool and the low murmur of the shepherds' voices. The air in the alcove still holds a faint trace of the sheep smell, but even that is fading now, replaced by the more permanent sense of stone and water and old paper. You shift your weight again and feel the familiar ache in your lower back. You consider sitting on the wooden stool that rests against the back wall of the alcove, but you know from experience that sitting for too long makes the damp from the river creep into your bones and leave you stiff and cold, even on a warm day. Instead, you step out of the alcove and onto the roadway of the bridge, stretching your legs and letting the full warmth of the sun fall on your face and shoulders. The stone beneath your feet is warm now, heated by hours of sunlight, and you can feel the heat rising through the thin soles of your shoes. You stand there for a moment with your eyes half closed, listening to the river and the distant sounds of the city behind you. The faint calls of vendors in the market square and the ringing of a bell from one of the many churches within the walls. You look down at the water of the Rhône as it flows beneath the bridge. The current is steady today, neither too fast nor too slow, and the color of the water is that particular shade of green-blue that means the river is carrying only a small amount of sediment from the mountains. You can see the bottom in the shallower areas near the banks, the rounded stones and patches of dark weed that shift gently in the flow. A small boat is visible far downstream, a fishing craft with a single occupant who sits motionless at the oars. The boat drifts slowly with the current, and you watch it until it passes behind the next arch and disappears from your view. You return to the alcove and look at the ledger page once more. 2 entries now mark the morning's work, 1 cart of hay and 1 flock of 42 sheep. The page is still mostly empty, a pale expanse of paper waiting to be filled with the small facts of this quiet day. You run your finger down the empty rows and think about the crossings that have not yet happened, the travelers who are still making their way toward the bridge from the villages and farms and distant towns. Each one will bring a small transaction. A few coins dropped into the lockbox, a few lines written in the ledger, a few tokens exchanged and carried away to be returned another day. This is the rhythm of your work, a slow, steady pulse that matches the rhythm of the river, and the rhythm of the seasons, and the rhythm of the years that pass like water flowing under a bridge that has stood here for more than 2 centuries, and will stand here long after you are gone. The shadow of the chapel bell tower has shifted again, shrinking to its smallest extent as the sun approaches its highest point. Soon it will be midday, and the bridge will grow quiet as the travelers pause to rest and eat and wait out the warmest hours. You will have time then to count the tokens in your pouch again, to stir the ink in its horn container, to listen to the river and watch the light move across the stones. The afternoon will bring more crossings and more entries in the ledger, but for now there is only this moment of stillness between one task and the next. You lean against the cool inner wall of the alcove and let your breathing slow to match the patient pace of the water below, waiting without expectation for whatever the next hour will bring across the bridge. The sun has climbed to a place in the sky where the shadows are short and the light has lost the golden quality of early morning and become something paler and more direct. You can feel the change in the air that moves through the alcove, a subtle warming that seems to rise from the stones themselves as well as from the sky above. The river continues its endless work below, and you have been listening to it for so long that the sound has become less a noise and more a condition of existence, like the weight of your own body or the slow rhythm of your heart. You have counted 2 more crossings since the flock of sheep passed through, both of them simple foot travelers who paid their single horn disc tokens and continued on their way without speaking more than a few words. Their entries sit in the ledger now, small marks on the page that record their passage but reveal nothing of who they were or where they were going. You are standing at the roadway window, with your forearms resting on the stone ledge, when you hear a sound that makes you lift your head and look toward the Villeneuve side of the bridge. It is not the squeak of a dry axle this time, but something deeper and more resonant, a low grinding sound that seems to come from the road itself rather than from any single source. You have heard this sound before and you know what it means. A heavy wagon is approaching, the kind that carries goods in bulk, and the weight of its load is pressing the iron tires of its wheels into the packed earth and stone of the road surface with enough force to create that particular grinding note. You straighten your posture and adjust your position so that you can see clearly down the length of the bridge. At first there is only the familiar view of the grey arches and the green bank beyond. But then you see movement near the far gate. 2 shapes emerge from the shadow of the gate opening, and as they come into the sunlight, you recognize them as mules rather than horses. Mules are common on this road because they can carry heavier loads than horses of similar size, and they are more sure-footed on the uneven surfaces of the old Roman roads that still connects many of the towns in this region. These 2 mules are a matched pair, both of them a dark grey colour that looks almost blue in the midday light, with long ears that swivel constantly as they walk, tracking sounds that you cannot hear from your position. The wagon that follows behind them is larger than the farm cart you saw earlier in the morning. It is a proper transport wagon built for long journeys, with high sides made of thick planks and a curved canopy of canvas stretched over wooden hoops to protect the load from weather. The wheels are tall, nearly the height of a man, with wide iron tires that distribute the weight across a larger surface of road. Even so, you can see the way the wheels press into the surface of the bridge as they roll, finding every slight depression and unevenness in the ancient stones. The sound of the wagon's passage reaches you as a complex arrangement of noises, the grinding of the wheels against stone, the creak of the wooden frame as it flexes under its load, the jingle of harness chains and the steady clop of 8 mule hooves striking the bridge in an alternating pattern. The driver sits on a high seat at the front of the wagon rather than walking beside his animals. This is another sign of a professional carrier rather than a farmer making a local trip. The driver holds the reins loosely in one hand, letting the mules find their own pace, and his posture on the seat suggests someone who has spent many hours in that same position. He wears a broad-brimmed hat of felted wool that shades his face from the sun, and a cloak of darker wool is draped over his shoulders despite the warmth of the day. Travelers who spend long hours on the open road learn to dress for all conditions because the weather can change quickly in the Rhône Valley, and a cloak that seems unnecessary at midday may be very welcome when the sun drops behind the hills and the wind begins to move down from the mountains. As the wagon draws closer, you begin to see the details of the load that it carries. The canvas cover is tied down tightly over the hoops, but you can see the shapes of what lies beneath pressing against the fabric from the inside. The load appears to be sacks, many of them stacked in layers and packed closely together so that they fill the entire bed of the wagon from the front board to the tailgate. You can see the bulges where individual sacks press against the canvas, creating a pattern of rounded shapes that repeats across the length of the load. And you can see something else that tells you exactly what those sacks contain. A fine white powder has sifted out through small gaps in the canvas and settled into the folds and creases of the fabric, and where the sun strikes this powder, it glitters faintly with a crystalline sparkle. Salt. The wagon is carrying salt from the marshes of the Camargue, that wide flat region where the Rhône meets the sea and the shallow lagoons evaporate under the Mediterranean sun to leave behind a white crust that has been harvested by men and women for thousands of years. Salt is a valuable commodity in this part of the world, and it travels under special license from the papal authorities. You know that the driver will have papers somewhere in his possession that authorize this transport, and that the toll for a wagon of salt is higher than the toll for a wagon of hay or wool. This is not your concern in the sense that you set the rates or enforce the regulations. Your task is simply to count what passes and collect what is owed according to the schedule that has been established by others. Still, you cannot help but note the weight of the load and think about the journey this salt has made from the bright lagoons of the coast up the valley of the Rhône to this bridge and beyond. The salt will eventually reach some town or city where it will be sold in small measures to households that will use it to preserve meat for the winter or to flavor their daily bread. The journey of a sack of salt is long and slow and involves many hands, and you are one small part of that chain. The wagon reaches your alcove, and the driver pulls gently on the reins to bring the mules to a halt. The animals stop with a collective exhale, their large heads dropping slightly as they rest their weight on 3 legs each. You can see the sweat darkening their grey coats where the harness presses against their shoulders and chests, and you can see the way their ribs move with each breath, a steady rhythm that matches the slow pace of their work. The driver sets the brake by pushing a wooden lever forward with his foot, and the mechanism engages with a solid clunk that you feel through the stones as much as you hear it. Then he climbs down from the high seat with the careful movements of a man whose legs have grown stiff from sitting. The driver walks toward your window, and you see his face clearly for the first time. He is a man of perhaps 40 years, with a short beard that is more grey than brown, and eyes that squint slightly from years of looking into bright sunlight and blowing dust. His tunic is good wool, but it is old and has been patched in several places with pieces of fabric that do not quite match the original colour. His hands are broad and the knuckles are enlarged in the way that comes from a lifetime of gripping reins and lifting heavy loads. He carries no visible purse or pouch, and you understand that he will pay the toll, not with coins, but with a document that authorizes the passage of salt under the papal seal. The driver stops at your window and reaches inside his tunic to produce a folded square of heavy paper. The paper is thicker than the sheets in your ledger, and it has been folded multiple times so that it fits into a small space. He unfolds it carefully and holds it out for you to see. The document is written in a formal hand that you recognize as the script used by the clerks of the Apostolic Camera, the same office that will eventually receive your ledger and count the tokens you have collected. The document bears a wax seal at the bottom, a circle of red wax impressed with the image of the crossed keys of Saint Peter. The seal is intact and unbroken, which means the document is valid, and the toll has already been accounted for in some larger ledger kept in a room within the palace walls. You do not need to read the entire document because you have seen many like it before. You note the date, which matches the current day, and you note the description of the load, which lists a specific weight of salt measured in units that the clerks use. Then you look up at the driver and nod to indicate that you accept the document as payment. The driver refolds the paper and returns it to its place inside his tunic. He does not ask for a token because the document itself serves as proof of payment, and he will present it again at the Avignon gate, where the guards will examine the seal and wave him through. This is a different system from the one used for farmers and shepherds and foot travelers, a parallel arrangement that operates on paper rather than tokens, but it is part of the same larger machinery that records and regulates the movement of goods across the papal territories. With the toll settled, you turn to your ledger and take up the quill. The driver waits without speaking, his eyes wandering across the familiar view of the bridge and the river and the palace towers beyond. He has made this journey many times before, and the ritual of the toll booth is as familiar to him as it is to you. You dip the quill into the ink and write in the first column the abbreviation for a heavy wagon, a mark that is different from the one you used for the haycart because the toll rate is different and the clerks will need to distinguish between the two types of crossing. In the second column you write a single stroke to indicate one wagon, though you also add a small notation that indicates the mules are included in the toll and need not be counted separately. In the third column you write the word for salt and a reference to the document number that you glimpsed on the paper, a small act of record keeping that may be useful if any question ever arises about this crossing. You set the quill down and look at the driver. He has been watching you write with a patience that seems to come naturally to men who spend their lives moving at the pace of mules and wagons. He gives you a brief nod and then turns back toward his wagon. You watch him climb onto the high seat with the same careful movements he used when descending, finding the footrest with his toe and pulling himself up with a grip on the side rail. Once seated, he releases the brake by pulling the wooden lever back toward himself, and the mechanism disengages with another solid sound. He gathers the reins and makes a small clicking noise with his tongue, a sound that the mules recognize as a signal to move. The animals lean into their harnesses and the wagon begins to roll forward with a groan of wood and iron that speaks of the great weight it carries. The wagon passes your window slowly, and you are close enough now to see the details of the canvas cover and the way the salt has leaked through the seams. Small white crystals cling to the fabric and sparkle in the sunlight, and a few of them fall as the wagon jolts over an uneven stone, drifting down to the roadway where they will soon be ground into dust by the wheels of other carts. You can smell the salt now too, a clean, sharp scent that is different from the other smells of the bridge. It reminds you of the sea, although you have never seen the sea yourself, only heard it described by travelers who have made the journey to the coast. They say the water there is a different color from the Rhône, a deeper blue that stretches to the horizon without any far bank to mark its limit. You try to imagine such a thing and find that you cannot quite hold the image in your mind. The wagon continues along the bridge, and you watch it grow smaller as it approaches the Avignon gate. The sound of its passage fades slowly, the grinding of the wheels and the creak of the frame and the jingle of the harness chains all diminishing together until they are absorbed into the larger soundscape of the river and the city. The two mules walk with their heads low and their long ears moving constantly, and the driver sits motionless on his high seat with the reins loose in his hand. The wagon passes through the gate and disappears into the shadow of the city walls, and the bridge is quiet again, except for the endless voice of the water below. You look down at the ledger entry you have just made. The ink has dried in the warm air, and the line of writing sits on the page alongside the earlier entries for the hay cart and the flock of sheep. The page is beginning to fill now, not quickly but steadily, each crossing adding another small fact to the record of this quiet day. You think about the salt wagon and its journey from the Camargue marshes, a journey that must have taken many days along roads that follow the river north. The driver would have passed through other toll stations before reaching yours, each one with its own ledger and its own clerk making similar entries in similar books. The salt itself is ancient, formed from seawater that evaporated under a sun that shone long before there were any bridges or cities or toll keepers to count the things that crossed them. The thought is too large to hold for long, and you let it drift away like the small white crystals that fell from the canvas onto the stones of the bridge. You shift your weight and feel the lockbox against your foot. The box is heavier now than it was this morning because it contains the coins from the hay cart and the sheep flock, and although the salt wagon paid with paper rather than silver, the weight of the other transactions has begun to accumulate. You reach down and touch the iron-bound lid with your fingertips, feeling the cool metal and the small slot where the coins drop through. The key to the lock hangs on its cord around your neck, and you feel its small weight against your chest when you move. At the end of the day, you will carry this box to the counting house near the palace, and a clerk will open it and count the coins and compare the total to the entries in your ledger. This is a ritual that happens every evening, and it has become so familiar that you could perform it in your sleep. The sun has passed its highest point and begun its slow descent toward the hills west of the Rhône. The light has changed again, losing some of its pale intensity and regaining a hint of the golden warmth that marked the early morning. The shadows of the bridge arches have begun to lengthen on the water below, stretching eastward across the surface of the river in dark bands that move almost imperceptibly as the afternoon advances. You can see the reflection of the chapel bell tower in the water now, a wavering image that breaks apart and reforms with each small ripple of the current. The image is never still and never exactly the same from one moment to the next, a shifting version of the solid stone tower that stands on the bridge above. You think about the afternoon that stretches before you and the crossings that have not yet occurred. There will be more carts and more foot travellers and perhaps another flock of animals before the light fades and the gate is closed. Each one will bring a small transaction and a few more lines in the ledger and a few more coins in the lockbox. The work is repetitive and quiet, and it asks nothing of you except your attention and your patience. You have learned over the years to give both freely, to let the rhythm of the bridge and the river carry you through the hours without resistance or complaint. This is not a dramatic life, but it is a steady one, and there is a kind of peace in the steadiness that you have come to value more than you might have expected when you first took up this post. You lean against the inner wall of the alcove, and let your eyes rest on the empty roadway that stretches toward the far gate. The stones are warm under the afternoon sun, and the river continues its endless work below. The salt wagon is somewhere in the city now, moving through the narrow streets toward whatever warehouse or market stall will receive its load. The driver will unload the heavy sacks and then find a place to rest himself and his mules before beginning the long journey back to the coast. The salt will be sold and used, and eventually it will dissolve and return to the earth in some form, completing a cycle that began in the sea. And you will remain here on the bridge counting the things that pass, adding small lines to a ledger that will one day be stored away and forgotten. A quiet record of a quiet year in a quiet place where nothing much ever happens except the slow accumulation of days, like stones laid one upon another to form a bridge that spans the flowing water of time. The afternoon arrives on the bridge with a quality of light that is different from anything that came before it. The sun has crossed the meridian and begun its slow slide toward the hills, but it has not yet reached the angle where the shadows lengthen dramatically and the gold returns to the stone. Instead, there is a period of several hours when the light seems to pause, hanging in a state of bright stillness that fills the air with a pale clarity. You have come to know this time well over the years. This stretch of the day when the heat rises from the stones in visible waves and the river seems to slow its pace, though you know the current does not actually change. The perception of slowness comes from within you rather than from the water itself, a natural response to the warmth and the stillness and the long empty space between one crossing and the next. You are standing at the roadway window with your weight shifted onto your left foot and your right shoulder resting against the cool inner wall of the alcove. The position has become comfortable through long habit, and you could maintain it for hours without much discomfort. The bridge stretches before you in both directions, empty of travellers and carts and animals, a pale grey ribbon of stone that connects the city walls of Avignon to the green bank of Villeneuve. The emptiness is not unusual for this time of day. The farmers who crossed in the morning have reached their destinations by now, and the travellers who will cross in the late afternoon have not yet begun their journeys. There is a natural pause in the rhythm of the road, a quiet hour or two when sensible people and animals rest in whatever shade they can find and wait for the worst of the heat to pass. The river continues its work below, and you listen to it with the kind of attention that is not really attention at all. The sound of the Rhône has become so familiar that you no longer hear it as a separate thing, but rather as the background against which all other sounds are measured. When a bird calls or a cart wheel squeaks, or a footstep falls on stone, you hear those sounds against the constant presence of the water. But when there are no other sounds, which is the case now, the river fills your awareness completely, and you become aware of its many layers and variations. There is the deep rushing of the main current as it passes through the center of the channel, a sound that seems to come from everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. There is the lighter lapping of water against the cutwater directly below your alcove, a sound that rises and falls in small waves as the current divides around the stone pier. And there is a third sound that you can only hear when the bridge is very quiet, a faint gurgling that comes from the place where the two divided streams rejoin on the downstream side of the arch. Each of these sounds is distinct, and each is part of the larger voice of the river, and you let them wash over you without trying to separate or analyze them. You look down at the ledger that lies open on the stone shelf. The page has received several entries since the morning began, each one a small record of a crossing that has already faded into the past. The hay cart with its squeaking wheel sits in the first row. The flock of 42 sheep occupies the second. A few foot travellers have their own lines, their passages marked by the simple abbreviation for a pedestrian and a single stroke in the quantity column. The salt wagon with its heavy load and its document under papal seal fills another row, its entry slightly longer because of the notation you added about the document number. And there have been 2 more crossings since the salt wagon passed. A small cart of vegetables and a man leading a single milk cow on a rope. Their entries are there too, written in the same careful hand, dried to the same permanent darkness. You run your fingertip down the column of numbers and add them in your head without conscious effort. The arithmetic is simple, and you have performed it so many times that the totals appear in your mind as though they had been waiting there all along. So many carts, so many animals, so many people. The sum is unremarkable, exactly what you would expect for a quiet weekday in late spring. There will be more entries before the day is over, but the shape of the day is already visible in the numbers that have accumulated. A gentle curve that rises in the morning and falls in the evening, with a flat middle where the afternoon stillness lives. You pick up the quill not because you need to write anything, but because the gesture of holding it has become a small comfort. The feather is warm from the air in the alcove, and the shaft fits into the groove between your fingers that has been worn there by countless hours of use. You turn the quill over in your hand and examine the point again, though you examined it only a short while ago. The nib is still sharp and the slit is still clean. A small amount of dried ink has collected near the tip, but not enough to affect the writing. You scrape it away with your thumbnail, and the dark flake falls onto the stone shelf, where it joins other small fragments of ink and paper and the fine dust that settles on every surface in this alcove. You set the quill down and pick up the inkwell instead. The horn container is warm in your palm and you can feel the weight of the ink inside, a liquid heaviness that shifts when you tilt the vessel. You remove the wooden stopper and look down into the dark opening. The ink is still at the same level it was this morning because you have written only a few lines and each line uses very little of the dark liquid. You can see the surface of the ink reflecting the light from the river window, a small circle of glossy black that shows you a distorted image of your own face if you lean close enough. The image is not clear, just a suggestion of features and the pale oval of your face against the darker background of the alcove. You do not lean close enough to see it clearly. Instead, you replace the stopper and set the inkwell back in its hollow on the shelf. The stillness of the afternoon has a quality that invites small actions of this kind, movements that serve no real purpose except to occupy the hands and provide a gentle focus for the mind. You find yourself straightening the stack of horn disc tokens, even though they are already perfectly aligned. You adjust the position of the bone squares so that the grid is exactly even with the edge of the shelf. You brush a few specks of dust from the cover of the ledger with the side of your hand. These actions are not necessary, but they are not meaningless either. They are a way of being present in the quiet space of the afternoon, a way of attending to the small world of the alcove, while the larger world of the bridge and the river and the city rests in the heat. You step out of the alcove and onto the roadway for a moment, letting the full warmth of the sun fall on your face and shoulders. The stone beneath your feet is hot now, heated by hours of direct sunlight, and you can feel the warmth rising through the soles of your shoes. You walk a few paces toward the center of the bridge and then stop, turning slowly to look in all directions. To the east, the city of Avignon rises behind its walls, the pale stone glowing almost white in the afternoon light. The towers of the Palace of the Popes are visible above the rooftops, their crenellations sharp against the pale blue of the sky. To the west, the bridge stretches toward Villeneuve and the green hills beyond, a landscape of cultivated fields and small clusters of trees that marks the beginning of the countryside. To the north and south there is only the river and its banks, the wide flowing water and the narrow strips of green that line its edges. You walk to the low parapet that runs along the edge of the bridge and lean your forearms on the warm stone. From here, you can look directly down at the water passing below. The surface of the Rhône is a moving mosaic of colors, pale green where the light penetrates, darker blue where the water is deeper, silver white where small ripples catch the sun and flash for an instant before disappearing. The current is visible as a pattern of movement, broad sheets of water sliding past each other at slightly different speeds, creating lines and swirls and small eddies that form and dissolve continuously. A leaf floats past, carried by the current, spinning slowly as it moves. You watch it travel from the upstream side of the bridge to the downstream side, a journey that takes perhaps 20 seconds. When it emerges on the other side of the arch, it continues on its way without pause, growing smaller and smaller until it disappears into the shimmer of light on the water. You stay at the parapet for a while, letting the warmth of the sun and the sound of the river and the gentle movement of the water fill your awareness. There is no need to hurry back to the alcove because you will hear any approaching traveler long before they reach the toll window. The sound of footsteps or cartwheels carries clearly across the bridge in the still afternoon air, and you have learned to trust your ears even when your eyes are elsewhere. So you remain where you are, your arms resting on the warm stone, your eyes following the patterns of the current, your mind drifting without direction through the quiet space of the afternoon. After some time, you push yourself upright and return to the alcove. The shade inside feels cool compared to the full sun of the roadway, and you appreciate the change. You take up your position at the window again and look out at the empty bridge. The shadow of the chapel bell tower has begun to lengthen once more, stretching eastward across the stones in a dark rectangle that grows almost imperceptibly as the sun continues its descent. You can measure the passage of time by this shadow as accurately as any clock. When the shadow reaches the third expansion joint in the stonework, you will know that the afternoon is advancing toward evening, and the traffic will soon resume. That point is still some distance away, and you have more stillness ahead of you before the rhythm of the bridge picks up again. You think about the lockbox on the floor near your foot and the coins it contains. The weight of the box has increased since morning, but not by very much. A few silver deniers and some smaller fractional coins rest on the wooden bottom, a modest collection that represents the morning's work. There is something satisfying about the accumulation, a visible proof of the transactions you have recorded. The coins are tangible, in a way that the entries in the ledger are not, though both serve the same purpose of accounting for what has passed. You reach down and touch the iron-bound lid with your fingertips, feeling the cool metal and the small slot where the coins drop through. The key to the lock rests against your chest under your tunic, a small weight that you are always aware of, even when you are not thinking about it. You hear a sound from the city side, and you lift your head to listen. It is not the sound of an approaching traveler, but something else, a distant ringing that you recognize as the bell of one of the city's many churches. The bell rings the hour of nones, the 9th hour of the day, according to the old reckoning, which falls in the middle of the afternoon. The sound is faint at this distance, the series of clear notes that drift across the rooftops and over the city walls and reach you on the bridge as a soft musical calling. You count the rings without meaning to, a habit from years of hearing the same bells. The ringing stops and the silence returns. But it is a different silence now, because it contains the memory of the sound that just passed. The bell reminds you that time is moving even in the stillness. The afternoon will not last forever, and the quiet will not last forever. Eventually the heat will begin to fade and the travelers will emerge from their resting places and resume their journeys. The road will fill again with carts and animals and people on foot, each one bringing a small transaction to your window. You will count and record and exchange tokens and drop coins into the lockbox, and the page in the ledger will fill with more lines of writing. This is the rhythm of your days, and you have come to trust it completely, knowing that the quiet hours are as much a part of the pattern as the busy ones. You reach for the leather pouch at your belt and loosen the drawstring. The tokens inside shift against each other with that soft, dry sound that you have come to associate with the small routines of your work. You do not take the tokens out this time because you already know how many remain. The count from this morning is still clear in your mind, and you have given out only a few tokens since then. The horn discs are somewhat diminished because of the foot travelers, the bone squares are fewer because of the sheep, and the wooden cart tokens are down by 2 because of the hay cart and the vegetable cart. The salt wagon paid with paper, so its passage did not require a token. The numbers are simple and they require no verification, but you find the act of touching the pouch and feeling the tokens inside to be a small comfort nonetheless. You lean against the inner wall of the alcove and let your eyes close for a moment, not because you are tired, though the warmth of the afternoon does invite a certain drowsiness, but because closing your eyes changes your perception of the bridge in ways that you have come to appreciate. Without sight, your hearing becomes sharper and more detailed. You can hear the river in all its layers more clearly. The deep rush and the light lap and the faint gurgle at the downstream join. You can hear the small creaks of the wooden gate at the far end of the bridge as it shifts in the gentle breeze that has begun to move across the water. You can hear a bird singing somewhere on the Villeneuve bank, a series of notes that rise and fall in a pattern you do not recognize but find pleasant. And you can hear your own breathing, slow and steady, a quiet rhythm that matches the rhythm of the river and the rhythm of the afternoon. You open your eyes and the visual world returns. The pale stone of the alcove and the brighter stone of the bridge and the blue-green water below. Nothing has changed in the moments your eyes were closed. The bridge is still empty and the river is still flowing, and the shadow of the chapel bell tower has moved only a tiny distance toward the expansion joint. The stillness continues and you continue with it, a patient presence in a quiet place where the only measure of time is the slow movement of light across ancient stones. You think about the evening that will come eventually, and the ritual of closing the gate and carrying the lockbox to the counting house. You think about the small room where the clerk will open the box and count the coins and compare the total to your ledger. You think about the walk back across the bridge in the dark with the empty box under your arm and the sound of the river louder in the night than it is during the day. These thoughts are not anxious or eager. They are simply the shape of the hours ahead, a familiar path that you will walk as you have walked it many times before. For now there is only the afternoon and the stillness and the patient waiting, and you find that you are content to remain exactly where you are, standing in your stone alcove above the flowing water, watching the shadow lengthen and listening to the river's endless voice. The stillness of the afternoon holds for a while longer, a suspended hour in which the light seems to hang motionless, and the river continues its work without any change in rhythm or tone. You remain at the window of the alcove with your thoughts drifting slowly from one small observation to another, never settling on any single thing for long. The shadow of the chapel bell tower has crept a little farther across the stones, and you note its position with the part of your mind that always tracks such details even when you are not consciously attending to them. The expansion joint is still some distance away, and you know that you have more quiet time ahead before the traffic of late afternoon begins to build. You let your breathing slow and your gaze soften, and you wait with the patience that has become as natural to you as the weight of the token pouch against your hip. The first sound that breaks the stillness comes from the Villeneuve side, and it is unlike any sound you have heard so far today. It is not the creak of wheels or the clop of hooves or the murmur of human voices. It is a series of short grunts and squeals, a low, continuous noise that seems to be made by many small throats at once. You recognize the sound immediately because you have heard it many times before, though not as often as the sounds of sheep or cattle. Pigs. A drove of pigs is approaching the bridge from the far bank, and the sound of their passage carries clearly across the water in the quiet afternoon air. You lean forward slightly and look down the length of the bridge toward the Villeneuve gate. At first you see only the empty roadway and the green bank beyond, but then movement catches your eye near the gate opening. The pigs emerge from the shadow of the gate in a loose, disorderly group that spreads across the width of the bridge and spills over onto the edges where the stone parapet rises. They are not a flock or a herd in the organized sense, but rather a collection of individual animals, each moving according to its own impulses within the general direction of travel. Their colors vary from pale pink to a deep rusty brown to a mottled black and white, and their shapes are round and low to the ground with short legs that move quickly in a trotting motion that seems always on the verge of breaking into a run. The swineherd walks behind the drove with a long stick made of a straight branch that has been stripped of its bark and polished smooth by years of handling. He is a man of indeterminate age whose face is hidden beneath a broad hat of woven straw that shades his features from the sun. His tunic is old and patched and stained with the marks of his trade, and his legs are wrapped in rough cloth that has been tied with strips of leather at the knees. He carries no pouch or bag that you can see, and you understand that his payment for the toll will come from a few small coins kept somewhere in the folds of his clothing. His voice reaches you as a low, tired sound that he directs at the pigs without any expectation that they will listen or obey. The words are not words really, but rather a stream of sounds meant to keep the animals moving in roughly the right direction. The pigs pay no attention to the swineherd, or to his stick, or to his tired voice. They move according to their own curiosity and appetite, stopping frequently to investigate something on the stones of the bridge with their wet snouts pressed to the surface. One pig discovers a small tuft of dried grass that has fallen from the hay cart earlier in the day, and it pauses to eat this morsel with a grunt of satisfaction. Another pig finds a crack between two stones and pushes its snout into the gap with great interest, even though there is nothing there to find. The drove spreads and contracts and spreads again like a living puddle of animals, and the swineherd moves behind them with the long stick tapping gently on the stones near their hindquarters to urge them forward. You begin your preparations for counting even though the pigs are still some distance away. Counting pigs is different from counting sheep because pigs do not move in a steady flow. They bunch together and then separate and then bunch again, and an individual animal may double back to investigate something it missed on the first pass. You have learned over the years that the only reliable way to count pigs is to wait until they have all passed your window, and then count them in retrospect. Holding the image of the drove in your mind, and separating it into individual animals after the fact. This requires a different kind of attention than counting sheep, a wider awareness that takes in the whole group without trying to track each animal individually as it passes. The drove draws closer, and the sound of their grunting and squealing grows louder. You can smell them now too, a rich, earthy smell of mud and animal sweat and the particular odor that pigs carry with them wherever they go. It is not an unpleasant smell exactly, but it is very present, filling the alcove and overwhelming the more subtle scents of river water and ink and old stone. The pigs are close enough now that you can see the details of their bodies, the coarse bristles that cover their skin, the small eyes that look out at the world with a curious intelligence, the constantly moving snouts that test the air and the ground for anything of interest. The hooves make a soft clicking sound on the stone that is different from the sharper click of sheep hooves, a duller percussion that seems to match their rounder shapes. The first pigs reach your window and you begin your silent count. You do not try to number them as they pass because they do not pass in an orderly line. Instead, you let the image of the drove imprint itself on your awareness, noting the positions of individual animals and the way they move in relation to one another. There is a large pale sow with a torn ear who stays near the front of the group. There is a smaller black pig with a white stripe across its shoulders who moves constantly from one side of the drove to the other, as though unable to decide where it wants to be. There is a group of 3 young pigs who stay close together and move as a single unit. These details help you to separate the drove into countable parts, even as the animals continue to shift and mingle. The swineherd passes your window as the middle of the drove moves by. He looks at you with tired eyes that seem to hold no particular expectation or concern. You nod to him, and he nods in return, a brief acknowledgement that the toll will be paid when the counting is done. He continues walking with his long stick held loosely in one hand, tapping it occasionally on the stones to encourage a pig that has stopped to investigate something particularly interesting. His voice continues its low stream of sounds, words that might be names for the pigs or simple encouragements or something else entirely. You cannot tell, and it does not matter. The last of the pigs pass your window, and you hold the final count in your mind. 17 pigs in total, a small drove by the standards of some you have seen, but a respectable number for a quiet weekday. You look at the swineherd who has stopped a few paces beyond your alcove, and is waiting with the same tired patience that marks every aspect of his bearing. He reaches into a fold of his tunic and produces 3 small coins, the same fractional silver that the shepherd paid earlier for his sheep. The toll for pigs is calculated differently than the toll for sheep, because pigs are valued differently in the markets, and the amount he places on your stone ledge is exactly correct for 17 animals. You take the coins and drop them through the slot into the lockbox where they land on top of the morning's accumulation with a soft click. Then you reach for the bone square tokens on your shelf and count out the number that corresponds to 17 pigs. You give the swineherd one of the larger tokens for 10 animals and 7 of the smaller tokens for the remainder. He takes them without comment and tucks them into the fold of his tunic from which the coins came. Then he turns and continues walking after his pigs, his long stick tapping and his tired voice murmuring and the drove moving ahead of him in its loose, disorderly way toward the Avignon gate. You turn to the ledger and take up the quill. The ink is still at a good consistency, and the nib writes smoothly as you record the passage of 17 pigs in the proper column. You write the number carefully, forming the digits with the same attention you give to every entry, and you add a brief note in the wider column about the direction of travel and the time of day. The ink dries quickly in the warm air that still moves through the alcove, though the warmth has begun to fade slightly as the afternoon advances. You set the quill down and watch the drove of pigs grow smaller as it moves toward the city gate, a shifting mass of round bodies and curling tails that will soon disappear into the streets of Avignon. The bridge is quiet again after the pigs pass, but the quiet has a different quality now. The stillness of the deep afternoon has been broken, and you can feel the day beginning to turn toward evening. The shadow of the chapel bell tower has reached the expansion joint and past it, creeping steadily eastward across the stones. The light has taken on a faint golden quality that was not present an hour ago, a softening of the harsh midday brightness into something warmer and more gentle. You know from long experience that the traffic will soon resume, not in a rush, but in a slow, steady trickle of carts and travellers making their way home or to market, or to whatever destination awaits them on the other side of the river. You do not have to wait long. The sound of wheels reaches you from the Villeneuve side once more, but this sound is different from the hay cart and different from the salt wagon. It is a heavier sound than the hay cart, but not as heavy as the salt wagon, and there is a particular resonance to it that suggests a load of dense solid objects, rather than sacks or bales. You look toward the far gate and see a cart emerging from the shadow, pulled by a single horse that walks with its head low and its neck bowed under the weight of the harness. The horse is a sturdy animal with a broad chest and thick legs, but even so you can see the effort in its movement, the way each step requires a visible push against the load behind it. The cart itself is a simple flatbed with low sides made of heavy planks. The load it carries is visible because there is no canvas cover, only a network of ropes that secure the cargo to the bed of the cart. And what a cargo it is! You can see the shapes clearly as the cart draws closer. There is a large wooden wheel mounted on a vertical axle, its rim thick and its spokes turned from dark wood. This is a potter's wheel, the kind used by craftsmen who shape clay into vessels of various sizes and shapes. The wheel is heavy and solid, built to withstand the constant pressure of wet clay and spinning motion. Beside the wheel are stacked several large jars of the type used to store glaze, each one sealed with a wooden lid and wrapped in straw padding to protect it during transport. The jars are tall and round-bellied with narrow necks, and they shift slightly as the cart moves over the uneven stones, held in place by the network of ropes. The driver walks beside the horse with one hand on the bridle and the other resting on the cart frame. He is a young man with the broad shoulders and strong arms of someone who works with clay and heavy equipment. His tunic is stained with patches of dried clay in various shades of grey and brown, the marks of his trade that no amount of washing will ever fully remove. He wears a simple cap on his head, and his face is flushed with the effort of guiding the heavy cart along the road. The horse breathes heavily, its sides moving in and out with each laboured breath, and you can see the sweat darkening its coat where the harness presses against its shoulders. The cart reaches the middle of the bridge, and you see the horse begin to struggle on the slight incline where the arch rises to its highest point. The driver notices and makes a soft sound of encouragement, but the horse slows further and then stops altogether, its legs trembling with fatigue. The driver does not strike the animal or raise his voice. Instead, he simply waits, letting the horse rest with its head hanging low and its breath coming in deep pulls of air. He looks out at the river as though the pause is a normal part of the journey, which for him it likely is. A load this heavy cannot be moved quickly or easily, and a wise driver learns to accept the rhythm that the horse sets rather than trying to impose a faster pace. You watch this small drama unfold from your alcove window. The horse stands motionless except for the movement of its breathing and the occasional flick of its tail against a fly. The driver stands beside it with his hand still on the bridle, but his attention elsewhere, his eyes following the flow of the river or perhaps resting on the distant towers of the palace. The potter's wheel gleams dully in the afternoon light, its dark wood polished by years of use and handling. The glazed jars shift slightly when a gust of wind moves across the bridge, but the ropes hold them secure. The pause stretches on, and you find that you do not mind the waiting. There is something restful about watching another person accept the necessity of patience, the simple acknowledgement that some things cannot be hurried. After a time that might be 2 minutes or might be 10, the horse raises its head and takes a deeper breath. The driver feels the change through his hand on the bridle and makes the soft, encouraging sound again. The horse leans into the harness and the cart begins to move, slowly at first and then with more confidence, as the animal finds its rhythm once more. The wheels turn and the heavy load shifts and the potter's wheel rocks slightly in its cradle of ropes. The cart approaches your alcove and the driver looks at you with an expression that holds neither apology nor explanation. This is simply how the journey goes. You've already prepared the wooden cart token that represents the toll for a vehicle of this type. The driver stops the horse with a low word and reaches into a pouch at his belt to produce the required silver denier. He places the coin on your stone ledge and you pick it up and drop it into the lockbox. The coin lands with a small sound that is already becoming familiar, the soft click of metal on metal as the box slowly fills. You hand the wooden token to the driver and he takes it with a nod, tucking it into his belt pouch alongside whatever other small items he carries. You turn to the ledger and record the passage of the cart. In the first column you write the abbreviation for a heavy cart, the same mark you used for the salt wagon because the toll rate is the same even though the cargo is different. In the second column you write a single stroke for one cart. In the third column you write a brief description of the load, a potter's wheel and glazed jars, and you add a note about the horse needing to rest on the bridge. This last detail is not required, but you include it sometimes when a crossing has a small moment of particularity, a variation from the usual pattern that seems worth recording, even though no one will ever read it or care. The ink dries and the entry becomes permanent. The driver makes his soft sound to the horse and the cart begins to move again. You watch it pass your window and continue along the bridge toward the Avignon gate. The horse walks with its head low, but its pace is steady now, the rest having restored some measure of its strength. The potter's wheel rocks gently and the glazed jars shift in their straw padding, and the driver walks beside his animal with the patient endurance of someone who has learned to measure distance not in miles but in the slow turning of wheels and the steady rhythm of hooves on stone. The cart passes through the gate and disappears into the city, and the bridge is quiet once more except for the river and the wind and the soft sounds of a day that is beginning its slow turn toward evening. The light begins to change in a way that you have witnessed many times, but never quite grown accustomed to. A slow transformation that creeps across the bridge and the river and the city walls with a gentleness that makes it easy to miss if you are not paying attention. You are paying attention because you have nothing else to do, standing in your alcove with the afternoon behind you and the evening ahead, and so you notice the exact moment when the pale brightness of the afternoon gives way to something warmer and deeper. The stones of the bridge shift from grey to gold, a honey-coloured glow that seems to rise from within the rock itself, rather than falling upon it from above. The river catches this new light and reflects it back in long ribbons of copper and bronze that stretch across the surface of the water and tremble with the movement of the current. The sky above the palace towers has begun to show the first hints of colour, a faint wash of rose and amber that will deepen as the sun continues its descent toward the hills west of the Rhône. You've been standing at the window for hours now, with only brief interruptions, and your body has grown stiff in the particular way that comes from remaining in one position on a stone floor. You shift your weight and roll your shoulders, feeling the small protests of muscles that have been held too long in stillness. The alcove has cooled slightly as the afternoon warmth fades, and you notice the change in the air that moves through the window openings. The breeze that comes off the river carries a different quality now, a hint of evening dampness that was not present during the warmer hours. It brushes against your face with a cool touch and carries with it the smells of the day's end, river mud exposed by the receding warmth, the faint smoke of cooking fires being lit in the city behind you, the green scent of the willows on the far bank releasing their moisture into the cooling air. You look down at the ledger page and see the entries you have made since the potter's cart passed. There have been 3 more crossings in the late afternoon, all of them simple foot travelers making their way from one side of the river to the other. A woman with a basket of bread returning to her village after selling at the city market. A young man carrying a bundle of tools who might have been a carpenter or a mason traveling to a job somewhere in the countryside. An older man with a walking stick and a small pack who said nothing and looked at nothing and seemed to be carrying the weight of a long journey in the set of his shoulders. Each of them paid a single horn disc token and each of them received a line in the ledger, small marks that record their passage without revealing anything of their stories. The page is more than half full now, the columns of writing descending toward the bottom edge in a steady accumulation of ordinary facts. The light continues to fade, and the gold deepens into orange, and the orange begins to shade toward the softer tones that come just before true dusk. You can no longer see the far bank clearly because the trees and the hills have begun to lose their distinct shapes, merging into a dark mass that rises against the glowing sky. The bridge itself is still visible, the arches repeating in a rhythm of shadow and fading light, but the details have softened and the edges have blurred. The river has darkened too, losing its daytime colors and becoming a broad ribbon of moving shadow with only the faintest glints of reflected sky on its surface. The sound of the water seems louder now, or perhaps it only seems louder because the other sounds of the day have fallen away and left the river as the dominant voice in the evening air. You reach up to the iron hook set into the stone above your head and lift down the small oil lamp that hangs there. The lamp is a simple object, made of brass, that has darkened with age and handling, a round reservoir for oil with a narrow spout that holds the wick. The wick is made of twisted linen fibers, and its upper end is charred black from many evenings of burning. You hold the lamp in both hands and feel its weight, the slight slosh of oil inside the reservoir that tells you there is enough fuel to last through the coming hours. You set the lamp on the stone shelf beside the ledger and reach for the small clay pot that sits in the corner of the alcove, where the wall meets the floor. The pot contains a supply of oil pressed from olives grown in the groves that cover the hills north of the city, a pale golden liquid that smells faintly of fruit and earth. You remove the stopper from the lamp's reservoir and pour in a small amount of fresh oil, watching the level rise until it reaches the mark you have learned to recognize by feel rather than sight. The oil glugs softly as it leaves the pot, a sound that belongs to the evening routine, as surely as the sound of the river belongs to the bridge. You replace the stopper and set the clay pot back in its corner. Then you take the small flint and steel from the niche where you keep them, a worn iron striker and a piece of dark flint that fits comfortably in your palm. You have lit this lamp so many times that your hands know the motions without any direction from your mind. You hold the flint near the wick and strike the steel against it with a quick downward motion, producing a small shower of sparks that scatter across the stone shelf. Most of the sparks die before they reach the wick, fading into the darkening air like tiny stars that burn for only an instant. You strike again, and this time a spark catches the fibers of the wick, a small glow that you nurture by leaning close and blowing gently until the glow becomes a flame. The flame is small at first and it wavers in the breeze that moves through the alcove, but it steadies as the wick absorbs more oil and the heat builds. The light it casts is warm and yellow, a small circle of illumination that pushes back the gathering darkness but does not defeat it entirely. You hang the lamp back on its iron hook and adjust the wick by turning the small brass wheel that raises or lowers the charred tip. The flame settles into a steady shape, a teardrop of light that flickers only slightly when the breeze shifts. The alcove is transformed by this small light into a different space than it was during the day. The walls seem closer and the ceiling lower, and the shadows in the corners have deepened into pools of absolute darkness that the lamp cannot reach. The stone shelf glows warmly where the light falls directly upon it, and the ledger page takes on a creamy color that makes the black ink stand out sharply. You can see the entries you have written more clearly now than you could in the fading daylight, the contrast between ink and paper heightened by the warm glow. You take up the quill and dip it into the ink, though you have nothing to write at this moment. The habit of holding the quill during the quiet spaces of the day is so deeply ingrained that you find yourself reaching for it without any conscious intention. The feather feels different in your hand under the lamplight, the shadows emphasizing its shape and the slight curve of the shaft. You touch the nib to a scrap of waste paper and watch a small line of ink appear, dark and glossy in the warm light. The line dries quickly and becomes a permanent mark, one more small addition to the accumulation of marks that fill your days. The sound of footsteps reaches you from the city side, and you look up from the quill to see a figure emerging from the shadow of the Avignon gate. The figure is small at this distance, and difficult to see clearly in the fading light, but you can tell from the rhythm of the footsteps that it is a person on foot rather than an animal or a cart. The steps are quick and light, the pace of someone who is walking with purpose but without hurry, a laborer returning home after a day of work in the city. As the figure draws closer, you begin to see details. A man in a simple tunic, with a cloth bag slung over one shoulder, his face tired but not unhappy, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He passes your window, and you see that his hands are stained with something dark, perhaps dye or ink or the residue of some craft that has occupied his hours. He pauses at your window and reaches into his pouch to produce a single small coin, which he places on the stone ledge without speaking. You take the coin and drop it into the lockbox, where it lands with a soft sound that is becoming familiar in its repetition. You give him a horn disc token from your pouch and he takes it with a nod, tucking it into his belt before continuing on his way. You turn to the ledger and dip the quill again, writing the abbreviation for a pedestrian and a single stroke in the quantity column. The ink looks different under the lamplight than it did during the day, blacker and more definite against the warm paper. You set the quill down and watch the man walk away toward the Villeneuve gate, his figure growing smaller and darker until it merges with the shadows at the far end of the bridge. More footsteps follow in the next hour, a steady trickle of people making their way home after the day's work. They come singly and in small groups, their voices carrying across the bridge in fragments of conversation that reach your ears as disconnected words and phrases. You hear someone speaking about the price of bread and the quality of the flour at a particular market stall. You hear a woman telling her companion about a length of cloth she saw that was too expensive for her purse, but beautiful enough to remember. You hear a young man boasting about the weight of a stone he lifted at the building site near the palace, his voice proud and slightly too loud in the quiet evening air. The words are not meant for you, and you do not try to follow them, letting them wash over you like the sound of the river, a human current that flows across the bridge and then fades into silence. Each traveler stops at your window and pays the toll, and each receives a token and a line in the ledger. The rhythm of this work is different from the rhythm of the daytime crossings. There are no carts to count, no animals to tally, no heavy wagons that pause on the bridge to rest. There are only people on foot, moving at their own pace, carrying the small burdens of their daily lives in baskets and bags and the set of their shoulders. The transactions are quick and simple. A coin dropped into the lockbox and a token handed over and a brief mark made on the page. You find that you can perform these actions almost without thinking, your hands moving through the familiar motions while your attention rests elsewhere, on the river or the lamplight or the soft sounds of the evening settling over the bridge. The sky outside your alcove has continued to darken while you worked, the last traces of color fading from the clouds above the palace towers. The stars have begun to appear in the east, small points of light that are barely visible against the deep blue of the early night. You can see a few of the brightest ones through the river window, their light steady and distant and utterly indifferent to the small transactions taking place on the bridge below. The river has become a black ribbon with only the faintest suggestion of movement, the current visible as a texture of darkness rather than a flow of water. The sound of the river is clearer now than it has been all day, filling the night air with its endless, patient voice. You adjust the wick of the lamp again, raising it slightly to compensate for the oil that has burned away. The flame brightens and steadies, casting a warm glow across the ledger page and the stone shelf and the small tokens that remain in their neat rows. You count the tokens without taking them from their places, your eyes moving across the stacks and grids and noting the numbers that remain. The horn discs are fewer now, diminished by the evening foot traffic. The bone squares are still plentiful because there have been no more animals since the pigs passed in the afternoon. The wooden cart tokens are nearly untouched, only 2 of them gone from the original 8. The numbers are small and simple, and they require no great thought to hold in your mind. You step out of the alcove and onto the roadway for a moment, leaving the warm circle of lamplight behind you. The night air is cool against your face, and you can feel the dampness rising from the river, a moisture that clings to your skin and makes the stones of the bridge glisten faintly in the starlight. You look up at the sky and see the great sweep of stars that stretches from horizon to horizon, a river of light that flows above the river of water below. The moon has not yet risen, and the stars are bright in its absence. Thousands upon thousands of small lights that have been shining since long before there was a bridge or a city or a toll-keeper to stand here and look up at them. The thought is too large to hold for long, and you let it drift away, returning your attention to the smaller world of the bridge and the alcove and the warm lamplight that waits for you inside. You return to your place at the window and look out at the empty roadway. The foot traffic has slowed to a trickle now, only occasional travelers making their way across the bridge in the darkness. You will wait here until the final crossing of the day, the last traveler or messenger or late worker who needs to pass from one side of the river to the other. After that, you will close the shutter and secure the lockbox, and carry the day's accumulation of coins to the counting house near the palace. But that is still some time away, and for now there is only the quiet of the evening and the small circle of lamplight and the endless voice of the Rhône moving beneath the arches. You lean against the cool inner wall of the alcove and let your breathing slow to match the patient rhythm of the night, waiting without hurry for whatever the final hour will bring across the bridge. The night has settled fully over the bridge by the time the foot traffic finally ceases, a deep quiet that seems to rise from the river itself and spread outward across the stones and the arches and the dark water below. You have been standing at the window for some time now without seeing any movement at either end of the bridge, your eyes adjusting to the darkness beyond the small circle of lamplight, so that you can make out the shapes of the gate at the far end and the faint outline of the chapel bell tower against the star-filled sky. The last traveller passed perhaps half an hour ago, a woman carrying a small child wrapped in a shawl. Her footsteps quickened light on the stones as she hurried toward the city gate. You recorded her passage in the ledger and dropped her coin into the lockbox and watched her disappear into the shadows of the Avignon gate. Since then there has been nothing but the river and the night and the slow movement of stars across the dark dome above. You know that there will be one more crossing before the gate is closed for the night. There is always one more crossing, a late traveller or a messenger, or someone whose business has kept them on the wrong side of the river until the final hour. You have learned to expect this last passage, to wait for it without impatience, because it is as much a part of the day's rhythm as the first cart of the morning or the stillness of the afternoon. The time of the final crossing varies with the season and the weather and the particular circumstances of the day, but it always comes eventually, a single figure emerging from the darkness with a lantern swinging from a pole or a hand, the light bobbing and weaving as the traveller makes their way across the ancient stones. You look down at the ledger page and see that it is nearly full. The columns of writing descend in orderly rows, each entry a small record of a crossing that has already faded into the past. There is the hay cart from the early morning with its squeaking wheel and its load of dried grass. There is the flock of 42 sheep, with their pale wool and their dark faces, and the 2 shepherds who walked with them. There are the foot travellers and the salt wagon and the drove of 17 pigs and the potter's cart with its heavy wheel and its glaze jars and the horse that needed to rest on the bridge. There are the evening pedestrians with their baskets and their tools and their tired faces, each one a line on the page and a coin in the lockbox. The sum of the day's work is visible there, in the careful handwriting and the orderly columns, the quiet record of a quiet day in a quiet year. You pick up the quill and touch the nib to the ink one more time, though you have nothing to write at this moment. The ink clings to the point in a small glossy bead that catches the lamplight and holds it for an instant before you touch the nib to the waste paper and draw a small line. The line is dark and sharp against the pale paper, a mark that serves no purpose except to confirm that the quill is still ready and the ink is still flowing. You set the quill down in its resting crack between the stones and look out the window again, searching the darkness for any sign of the final traveller. The sound reaches you before the light does, a soft rhythm of footsteps on stone that seems to come from the Villeneuve side of the bridge. You turn your head slightly to better catch the direction, and you are certain now that someone is approaching from the far bank. The footsteps are slow and measured, the pace of a person who is tired or carrying something heavy or simply in no hurry to reach their destination. You wait and listen, and after a few moments you see the light. It is a small flame visible through the windows of a lantern, a warm glow that swings gently with each step of the person carrying it. The lantern hangs from a short pole that the traveller holds over one shoulder, and the light it casts illuminates a small circle of the bridge surface and the lower portion of the person walking behind it. As the traveller draws closer, you begin to see details emerging from the darkness. It is a man of middle age, with a short beard and a cloak of dark wool that falls to his knees. He carries a leather satchel slung across his body, the strap cutting diagonally across his chest, and the satchel appears to be full of something that gives it a rounded shape. His boots are worn but well made, the kind of footwear that belongs to someone who travels often but not far, perhaps a messenger or a clerk who moves between the smaller towns and villages on one side of the river and the other. His face is tired in the way that comes from a long day of walking or riding, the muscles slack and the eyes heavy, but his pace is steady, and he does not stumble on the uneven stones. He reaches your window and stops, setting the lantern pole down so that its base rests on the bridge surface while the light continues to illuminate the space around him. He looks at you with eyes that have grown accustomed to the darkness, and then to the lamplight, blinking once or twice as his vision adjusts. He does not speak immediately, and neither do you, the two of you sharing a moment of quiet acknowledgement that this is the last crossing of the day, and that both of you are tired and ready for the night to claim its proper hour. He reaches into a fold of his cloak and produces a single silver denier, the same coin that the farmer paid for the hay cart and that countless others have paid for their crossings throughout the day. He places the coin on your stone ledge where it catches the lamplight and gleams dully, a small circle of silver that represents the final transaction of this quiet day. You pick up the coin and drop it through the slot into the lockbox, listening to the soft sound it makes as it lands on top of the day's accumulation. The box is heavier now than it was this morning, the weight of the coins pressing down on the wooden bottom, and you can feel the difference when you brush your foot against its iron-bound side. You reach into your pouch and find one of the remaining horn disc tokens, the small circle of polished horn that represents a single pedestrian crossing. You hold it out through the window, and the traveller takes it with a nod, tucking it into whatever pocket or pouch he carries for such small items. He picks up his lantern pole and adjusts the satchel on his shoulder, settling the weight more comfortably against his hip. Then he continues on his way, his footsteps fading into the darkness as he walks toward the Avignon gate and the sleeping city beyond. The light of his lantern grows smaller and smaller until it is just a point of warmth in the distance, and then it passes through the gate and disappears entirely. You stand at the window for a few moments longer, listening to the silence that follows the final crossing. The river is the only voice now, its endless, patient sound filling the night air with a presence that is both constant and soothing. The stars continue their slow movement across the sky, and the moon has still not risen above the hills to the east. The bridge is empty in both directions, a pale grey ribbon of stone that stretches from one dark bank to the other, connecting two worlds that have both retreated into the quiet of the night. You turn away from the window and begin the small rituals that mark the end of your day. The first task is to close the heavy wooden shutter that covers the roadway window. The shutter is made of thick planks joined together with iron straps, and it swings on heavy hinges that protest with a low creak when you move it. You grasp the edge of the shutter and pull it across the window opening, feeling the weight of the wood and the resistance of the hinges. The shutter meets the stone frame with a solid thud, and you slide the iron bolt into its socket, securing it against the night. The sound of the river changes slightly when the shutter is closed, becoming more distant and muffled, though you can still hear it clearly through the smaller river window that remains open to the air. You turn next to the tokens on the stone shelf. The horn discs and the bone squares and the wooden cart tokens are still arranged in their neat rows and stacks, though the numbers have diminished over the course of the day. You gather them together and count them one final time, touching each token as you move it from the shelf to your palm. The count matches what you expected based on the entries in the ledger and the tokens you have given out. You pour the tokens back into the leather pouch at your belt and pull the drawstring tight, feeling the familiar weight settle against your hip. The pouch will travel home with you tonight and return with you in the morning, ready for another day of counting and exchanging. The ledger is the next item to be secured. You close the heavy cover and feel the familiar weight of the bound pages pressing together. The book has a solidity that is satisfying in a way that is difficult to describe, a physical presence that matches the weight of the day's record contained within its pages. You run your palm across the worn leather cover, feeling the small creases and stains that mark its age and use. Then you lift the ledger and place it in the small niche at the back of the alcove where it will rest until morning. The niche is a hollow carved into the stone, just large enough to hold the book, and it keeps the ledger dry and protected from the damp air that rises from the river at night. You look around the alcove one more time, checking that everything is in its proper place. The inkwell is stoppered and secure in its hollow on the shelf. The quill rests in its crack between the stones. The clay pot of oil sits in its corner with the stopper firmly in place. The lamp continues to burn on its iron hook, casting a warm glow across the empty shelf and the closed shutter and the stone walls that have enclosed you through all the hours of this quiet day. You will leave the lamp burning for now because you need its light to complete the final tasks, but you will extinguish it before you leave the alcove for the night. The lockbox sits on the floor near your right foot, and you bend down to lift it with both hands. The box is heavy now, much heavier than it was when you placed it here in the darkness before dawn. The coins inside have accumulated throughout the day, each crossing adding a small weight of silver to the total. You can feel the coins shift as you lift the box, a soft sliding sound that speaks of the day's work made tangible. You hold the box against your chest with one arm while you reach for the key that hangs on its cord around your neck. The key is small and dark, its iron surface warmed by the heat of your skin. You do not need to unlock the box here because the clerk at the counting house will do that when you arrive. The key is simply a reminder of the trust placed in you, a small symbol of the chain of responsibility that extends from the bridge to the palace to the papal treasury itself. You take one last look at the alcove before you step out onto the roadway. The lamp still burns on its hook, but you will return to extinguish it after you have locked the outer shutter. You step through the narrow opening and onto the bridge, feeling the cool night air against your face and the solid stone beneath your feet. The stars are bright overhead, thousands of small lights scattered across the dark dome of the sky, and the river is a broad black presence below, its voice filling the night with an endless patient sound. You stand for a moment with the lockbox held against your chest, breathing in the cool air and letting the quiet of the night settle around you. The outer shutter covers the entrance to the alcove, a larger version of the window shutter made from the same thick planks and iron straps. You set the lockbox down carefully on the bridge surface and grasp the edge of the shutter, pulling it across the opening until it meets the stone frame. The hinges protest with the same low creak you heard from the window shutter, a sound that seems very loud in the quiet of the night, but which the river quickly absorbs and carries away. You slide the iron bolt into its socket and feel the solid thunk of metal meeting metal. The alcove is now sealed for the night, a small stone room that will wait in darkness until you return in the morning. You pick up the lockbox again and begin the walk toward the Avignon gate. The stones of the bridge are familiar beneath your feet even in the darkness, and you find your way without needing to look down. The river flows beneath the arches to your right, its voice a constant companion that walks with you across the ancient span. The chapel of St. Nicholas rises from the bridge ahead of you, a dark shape against the slightly less dark sky, its bell tower pointing upward toward the stars. The chapel door is closed, and no light shows through the small window above the altar. The canons who say the offices there have long since retired to their quarters, and the bell will not ring again until the morning calls them back to prayer. You pass the chapel and continue toward the city gate. The walls of Avignon rise before you, tall and dark and solid, their crenellations sharp against the starry sky. The gate is closed at this hour, but the small postern door beside it will be unlocked for you, because the guards know that the tollkeeper comes at this time each night with the lockbox. You can see the faint glow of a torch burning somewhere beyond the wall, a warm light that spills through the gaps in the gate and paints thin lines of gold on the dark stones. The sound of the city is different from the sound of the bridge, a low murmur of many small noises that blend together into a single presence. You can hear voices somewhere in the distance and the bark of a dog, and the faint ringing of a smith's hammer from a workshop where someone is working late. You reach the postern door and shift the lockbox to one arm so that you can raise your free hand and knock. The wood is thick, and your knuckles make a soft sound against it, but the guard on the other side is expecting you, and the door swings open almost immediately. The guard is a young man with a face you recognize but a name you have never learned. He holds a torch in one hand, and the light flickers across his features, casting shifting shadows that make his expression difficult to read. He nods to you and steps aside to let you pass, and you step through the narrow opening into the city. The streets of Avignon are narrow and winding, their surfaces made from the same pale stone as the bridge. You walk with the lockbox held securely against your chest, following a route that you have traveled so many times it requires no conscious thought. The way to the counting house leads past the market square, which is empty now, except for a few stray dogs sleeping in doorways and a cat that watches you pass with glowing eyes. The stores where vendors sell their goods during the day are shuttered and dark, their wooden fronts closed and locked against the night. The smells of the market linger in the air, a complex mixture of spices and bread and vegetables, and the faint animal scent of the livestock that are penned nearby. The counting house is a small building attached to the side of a larger administrative structure near the palace walls. A single window shows a light burning within, and you know that the clerk who receives the lock boxes from the various toll stations around the city is waiting for you. You push open the door and step into a small room with a high ceiling and a stone floor. The clerk sits at a wooden table with a large ledger open before him, a ledger that is much larger and more official than the one you carry in your alcove. He is an older man with thin grey hair and spectacles perched on his nose, and he looks up when you enter with an expression of patient expectation. You set the lockbox on the table, and the clerk produces a key from his desk that matches the lock. He opens the box and tips the contents carefully onto a felt cloth spread across the tabletop. The coins spill out in a small pile of silver, the day's accumulation of tolls from the bridge. The clerk counts them with quick practiced movements, his fingers sorting and stacking and tallying with a speed that comes from years of repetition. When he finishes, he writes a number in his large ledger and then looks at you for confirmation. You nod because the number matches the total you carried in your head across the bridge. The clerk closes his ledger and returns the empty lockbox to you, and the transaction is complete. You leave the counting house with the empty box under your arm and begin the walk back toward the bridge. The streets are even quieter now, the city settling into the deeper silence of the late night. You pass through the postern door again, and the guard nods to you once more, closing the door behind you with a soft thud. The bridge stretches before you in the starlight, a pale grey path that leads back to your alcove and the small routines that will close the day completely. The river is still speaking below, its voice unchanged by the darkness or the hour, a constant presence that has been here since long before there was a bridge and will remain long after. You walk back across the bridge with the empty lockbox under your arm and the night air cool against your face. The stars continue their slow rotation overhead, and the moon has finally begun to rise above the eastern hills, a thin crescent of silver that adds its pale light to the darkness. You reach your alcove and retrieve the lamp that still burns inside, extinguishing the flame with a gentle breath that leaves the wick smoking faintly in the sudden darkness. You set the lamp on its hook and close the inner door, leaving the small stone room to wait in silence for the morning. Then you walk slowly toward the city gate, and whatever small room and simple bed await you there, carrying with you the quiet satisfaction of another day completed, another page filled, another small chapter in the long, slow story of the bridge and the river, and the patient work of counting the things that pass. The empty lockbox is light under your arm as you walk back across the bridge, its iron-bound corners pressing against your side with a familiarity that has become part of your body's memory. The weight you carried to the counting house is gone now, transferred to the clerk's ledger and the felt cloth and the strongbox that will eventually travel to the larger treasury within the palace walls. What remains in your possession is only the container itself, a wooden box with iron straps and a simple lock, empty of coins but full of the day's echo. You can still feel the ghost of the weight in your muscles, a phantom heaviness that will fade by morning but which lingers now as you make your way across the ancient stones. The moon has risen above the eastern hills, a thin crescent that hangs low in the sky and casts a pale silver light across the bridge and the river and the dark shapes of the city walls behind you. The moonlight is not bright enough to read by or to see fine details, but it is enough to transform the familiar landscape into something softer and more mysterious. The stones of the bridge glow with a faint luminescence, their grey surfaces touched with silver where the light falls directly upon them. The river below is a broad expanse of moving darkness, with a single path of reflected moonlight stretching across its surface, a shimmering road of light that leads from the bridge to the far bank and then dissolves into the deeper shadows of the night. You stop in the middle of the bridge, somewhere between the chapel of St. Nicholas and the place where the archers begin their descent toward the Villeneuve gate. There is no particular reason for stopping except that the night is quiet and the bridge is empty, and the moment seems to invite a pause. You set the empty lockbox down on the stone parapet and rest your forearms beside it, leaning forward slightly to look down at the water passing below. The current is visible now only as a texture of darkness, a flowing surface that catches the moonlight in small ripples and eddies, and then releases it again. The sound of the river fills the night air with a presence that is both constant and varied. The deep rush of the main channel and the softer lapping against the cutwaters, and the faint gurgle where the divided streams rejoin on the downstream side. You have been listening to this sound all day, and you will listen to it again tomorrow, and the familiarity of it is a comfort that you no longer notice consciously, but which you would miss terribly if it were ever taken away. You think about the sum total of the day that has just ended. The numbers come to you easily because you have held them in your mind throughout the hours of counting and recording. 24 horn disc tokens given to pedestrians crossing on foot, each one representing a single person with a destination and a purpose and a story you will never know. 42 sheep in a single flock, their pale wool glowing in the morning light as they flowed past your window like a river of animals crossing the river of water below. 17 pigs in a disorderly drove, their grunts and squeals filling the afternoon air and their round bodies spreading across the width of the bridge. 4 carts of various kinds, from the farmer's hay wagon with its squeaking wheel to the heavy salt wagon with its papal document and its mule straining under the load, to the potter's cart with its wheel and glazed jars and the horse that needed to rest on the incline of the arch. Each cart carried something different, and each paid the same toll, a silver denier dropped into the lockbox and a wooden token handed over in return. The numbers add up to a modest total, a quiet day's work that will be entered into a larger ledger and then forgotten, except by the stones of the bridge and the flowing water and the stars that watched it all unfold from their distant places. The moon continues its slow climb above the hills, and the light shifts slightly, casting new shadows across the bridge surface. You can see the outline of the chapel bell tower more clearly now, its square shape rising against the starry sky with a solidity that speaks of centuries of standing in this same place. The chapel was built long before you came to work on this bridge, built by hands that have long since returned to the earth, and it will stand long after you are gone. The thought does not trouble you. There is a kind of peace in knowing that you are part of something larger than yourself, a small link in a chain that stretches backward into the past and forward into a future you will never see. The work you do is humble and repetitive and easily forgotten, but it is necessary in its own quiet way. The bridge requires someone to stand at the window and count the things that pass, and you have become that someone through years of patient attendance. You pick up the empty lockbox and continue walking toward the Villeneuve end of the bridge. The night air is cool and damp, carrying the smell of the river and the faint green scent of the willows on the far bank. Your footsteps are the only sound besides the water, a soft rhythm of leather on stone that seems very small against the vast presence of the night. You pass the place where the hay cart stopped this morning, the driver walking beside his horse with the squeaking wheel marking each rotation. You pass the spot where the flock of sheep flowed around the older shepherd like water around a stone, their small hooves clicking on the ancient surface. You pass the place where the salt wagon paused while you examined the papal document, the mules breathing heavily and the driver sitting motionless on his high seat. Each of these places is identical to every other place on the bridge in terms of stone and mortar and the passage of centuries, but they are marked in your memory by the small events of the day, a map of moments that exists only in your mind. You reach the Villeneuve gate and stop before the closed wooden doors. The gate is locked at this hour, and the guard who opened it this morning has long since retired to whatever small room he occupies on the far bank. You do not need to pass through the gate because your own small room is on the Avignon side of the river, somewhere within the tangle of narrow streets that climb toward the palace walls. You have walked to this end of the bridge, not out of necessity, but out of a quiet desire to see the whole span from one end to the other, to stand for a moment at the far threshold and look back toward the city that has been your home for more years than you care to count. You turn and face the bridge again, looking east toward Avignon. The arches stretch before you in a diminishing series of pale curves, each one a repetition of the one before it, each one carrying the weight of the roadway and the parapets and the chapel that rises from the middle span. The moonlight catches the edges of the stones and paints thin lines of silver along the joints and the corners, creating a pattern of light and shadow that shifts as you watch. The city walls rise beyond the far end of the bridge, their crenellations dark against the slightly less dark sky, and above the walls the towers of the Palace of the Popes catch the moonlight on their highest points. A few lights burn within the city, small warm glows that mark the windows of people who are still awake at this late hour. You wonder briefly what they are doing. Those distant strangers whose lives intersect with yours only in the sense that you share the same walls and the same river and the same night sky. Perhaps they are reading or working, or simply sitting in the quiet of their rooms as you are standing in the quiet of the bridge. The thought passes and fades, leaving only the present moment and the sound of the water and the pale light of the moon. You begin the walk back toward the Avignon side, retracing your steps across the ancient stones. The empty lockbox swings gently at your side and you shift it to a more comfortable position, tucking it under your arm once more. The weight is negligible now, but the shape of it is familiar, a rectangular presence that has accompanied you on this nightly walk so many times that you would feel its absence more than its presence. Tomorrow morning you will carry it back to the alcove, empty and waiting, and the cycle will begin again. A cart will approach with a squeaking wheel or a load of hay, a flock of sheep will flow across the stones, a traveller will place a small coin on your window ledge, and you will drop it into the box and record the passage in the ledger. The work is simple and repetitive, and it asks nothing of you except your attention and your patience, both of which you have learned to give freely over the years. You pass the chapel of St. Nicholas again, and pause to look up at its dark windows. The small building sits on the bridge like a stone ship anchored in the flowing water, its bell tower rising toward the stars with a quiet dignity. The bell is silent now, but it will ring again in the morning, calling the canons to their prayers and marking the hours for everyone within hearing distance. You have come to measure your days by that bell, its clear notes dividing the long hours into manageable segments, a rhythm of sound that overlays the deeper rhythm of the river. You do not know the names of the canons or the words of their prayers, but you appreciate the regularity of their presence, the simple fact that someone else is also keeping time on this bridge. You continue walking, and the city gate draws closer with each step. The postern door where you entered and left earlier is still unlocked, or perhaps the guard has locked it and will open it again when you knock. Either way, you will pass through and find your way to the small room that waits for you somewhere in the maze of streets. The room is modest, a single chamber with a bed and a table and a narrow window that looks out over a courtyard rather than the river. You will light a small candle and sit for a while in its warm glow, letting the events of the day settle into memory. Then you will lie down and close your eyes and listen to the distant sound of the Rhône, which is audible even from your room on quiet nights like this one. The river will be the last thing you hear before sleep takes you, and the first thing you hear when you wake. You reach the postern door and raise your hand to knock, but the door swings open before your knuckles touch the wood. The guard is there with his torch, its flame flickering in the night breeze, and he nods to you with the same silent acknowledgement that has passed between you countless times before. You step through the narrow opening and into the city, and the door closes behind you with a soft thud. The sound of the river changes immediately, muffled by the walls and the buildings and the narrow streets, but it is still there in the background, a constant presence that underlies all the other sounds of the city at night. You walk through the dark streets with the empty lockbox under your arm, and the memory of the day's crossing slowly fading from the front of your mind. The market square is empty and silent, the stalls shuttered, and the stray dogs sleeping in their doorways. The cat that watched you pass earlier is gone now, vanished into whatever hidden places cats go when the night deepens. The smells of the city are different at this hour, less complex and more earthy. The scent of stone and dust and the faint trace of wood smoke from chimneys that have long since gone cold. Your footsteps echo softly in the narrow passages, a solitary sound that marks your progress through the sleeping streets. You turn a corner and see the familiar outline of your building ahead, a simple structure of pale stone with a wooden door and a single shuttered window on the upper floor. You climb the worn stone steps and fit your key into the lock, a smaller key than the one that hangs around your neck, but similar in its dark iron and its simple shape. The door opens with a familiar creak, and you step into the small entryway, closing the door behind you and sliding the bolt into place. The interior is dark and still, smelling of old wood and the faint residue of yesterday's bread. You climb the narrow stairs to your room and open the door, entering the small space that contains everything you own. You set the empty lockbox on the table beside the unlit candle and the flint and steel that wait there. You do not light the candle immediately because the moonlight coming through the narrow window is enough to see by a pale silver rectangle that falls across the floor and climbs the opposite wall. You sit on the edge of your bed and remove your shoes, feeling the cool layer on your feet and the relief of pressure that comes from releasing them from leather. You sit there for a while in the darkness, listening to the distant sound of the river and the even more distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the city. The day is over, and the night is yours, a space of quiet hours that stretches between now and the moment when you will rise and walk back to the bridge and open the gate for another day of counting. You think about the ledger that waits in its niche in the alcove, its pages open to the day that has just ended. Tomorrow you will turn to a fresh page, a new sheet of the same rough paper with the same watermark of the bell tower visible when held to the light. You will write the date at the top of the first column and arrange the tokens on the stone shelf and stir the ink in its horn container. The first traveller will come, perhaps the farmer with the squeaking wheel, or the shepherd with his flock, or someone entirely new whose face you have never seen. You will count what passes and record it in the ledger, and drop the coins into the lockbox, and the day will unfold in its familiar rhythm, a slow accumulation of small facts that will fill the page by evening. This is the shape of your life, and you have come to accept it as you accept the shape of the stones under your feet, and the weight of the pouch against your hip, and the endless voice of the Rhône moving beneath the arches. You lie back on the bed and let your eyes close. The sound of the river is clearer, now that you are still, a distant rushing that seems to come from everywhere at once. You can feel the day's fatigue settling into your muscles, a pleasant heaviness that promises rest. The numbers of the day float through your mind one last time. 24 pedestrians and 42 sheep and 17 pigs and 4 carts, each one a small story that has already faded into the past. You let the numbers go and they drift away like leaves on the surface of the river, carried downstream toward the sea and the great forgetting that awaits all things. You breathe slowly and deeply, and the sound of the water fills your awareness until there is nothing else, only the river, and the night, and the quiet promise of another day on the bridge, when the morning light returns to the ancient stones of Avignon.